Today, I'm going to share 3 stories about ordinary people who at some point made a decision that not only completely changed their lives, but also impacted the lives of millions and millions of other people as well. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please rewire the like button's house so that every time they turn on their desk lamp, the stove turns on. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One morning in the early spring of 1943, a 29-year-old woman named Carolyn hunched over a sink basin that was inside of a laboratory in a US government building in Washington, D.C. And this basin was full of this greenish-blue liquid that smelled so bad it actually was making Carolyn nauseous. But she couldn't leave the room because this was her job. I mean, this was a highly classified and potentially life-saving thing that she was doing. And so Carolyn checked the recipe one more time on the clipboard right next to her, and then measured out 1 cup of the special type of acidic salt, and she poured it into the liquid, and she sort of plugged her nose as it began to bubble and more gross vapors began to come up into the air. So Carolyn worked for a government agency called the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, which was a precursor to the CIA. Carolyn had actually tried first to join the Navy and also the Army. She had applied to do administrative work because at the time, women were not allowed to do anything in combat roles. However, both the Navy and the Army turned her down for a really weird reason. So at the time, these 2 branches of the military were looking for people to fill their administrative roles. Namely, they were looking for secretaries. But specifically, they were seeking secretaries who could take notes in meetings and go basically completely unnoticed. But Carolyn was sort of impossible to ignore. She was 6 foot 2 inches tall, and she had a booming voice and a huge personality. And so basically, she drew a lot of attention, and the military had known that very likely her presence would be too distracting in these meetings, and so that's why they turned her down. So when she was rejected, Carolyn had gone on to apply for work at the OSS, hoping to maybe become a spy. But they also turned her down really for the same reason. She was just too conspicuous to blend into a crowd, so how could she possibly be a spy? Now, for Carolyn, this had been sort of heartbreaking. I mean, it was sort of like, she thought she was going to be able to serve her country, and now she's being told, you basically can't. And so feeling like, she didn't have much to lose, she just went to the OSS and just said, look, I know I can't be a spy, but do you have any other jobs available that I could do? What do you got? Anything. I'm open to it. And it was through this approach that the OSS said, actually, yes, we do have something for you. And she would go on to become the executive assistant to one of the lead scientists for the OSS. And so now, in that capacity, she was working on a very important secret science project for the government. And so that day in the lab, after the mixture had stopped bubbling a little bit, Carolyn very carefully added some more ingredients. There was some copper acetate and black food dye, and then once they were in the wash basin as well, it was done. At this point, Carolyn very carefully scooped some of this mixture up in a ladle, and she poured it into a glass beaker and then handed it off to a lab assistant and told him she had followed the recipe exactly. He took the mixture and thanked her and told her he was now going to dehydrate it into several solid cakes, and then they would test it. A few weeks later, Carolyn was back in the laboratory copying some notes from some of the more recent versions of the experiment she'd been working on. And she looked up when her boss, a scientist named Major Harold J. Coolidge, walked into the room. Major Coolidge was a scientist from Harvard University, and he was in charge of this whole secret project that Carolyn was working on. And he walked in and he had a big smile on his face, and he put a memo down on the table in front of Carolyn. And Carolyn grabbed it and she read it over, and as she did, her heart began to race. The memo said that the US Navy had taken different versions of the dehydrated cakes that they had been making, out into the ocean to shark-infested waters and then attached these cakes to bags of raw fish meat and submerged them in the water. And a lot of curious sharks had come over to investigate the meat, but none of them had actually taken a bite. And this was exactly what Carolyn and her boss and her colleagues had all hoped for. So the government had basically hired the OSS to create a brand new life-saving product, shark repellent. And soon, this very same shark repellent that Carolyn worked on was actually issued to the entire US Navy. However, while this shark repellent was undoubtedly Carolyn's first big recipe, it would not be her last. After she left the OSS, she eventually moved to Paris, France, where her life would change forever. Because there, Carolyn fell in love with French cuisine. And even though she had literally zero culinary training aside from, mixing up shark repellent recipes, she enrolled at a legendary culinary school called Le Cordon Bleu. Now, she was the only woman in her class, and at first, because again, she had no skills in cooking, she really struggled to hang on to the curriculum. But she would figure it out, and eventually she would not just graduate, she would go on to become an exceptionally talented chef. She went on to co-author a cookbook that sold more than 3.5 million copies, and then after that, she landed a deal for a cooking show on TV. And viewers all over the world not only loved her cooking, but they really just fell in love with her, like her personality. And so she would go on to become one of the most beloved and influential chefs in history, credited with bringing French cooking into American homes. Before there was Gordon Ramsay or Barefoot Contessa, there was Carolyn, a 6'2" celebrity chef with a booming voice and a magnetic personality who used to make shark repellent. The very traits that initially kept her from serving her country made her unforgettable in every kitchen in America. Her middle name was Carolyn, but you know her as Julia Child. Minimum payments are not designed to get people out of debt. They're designed to keep them stuck. That's why so many people are turning to PDS Debt for a real solution. PDS Debt can reduce up to half of what's owed on credit cards, personal loans, and even medical bills. The process starts with a free 30-second assessment at pdsdebt.com/MrBallin. PDS uses AI and data to go beyond the numbers and personalize saving solutions for each person's situation. Instead of juggling multiple payments every month, PDS Debt can help combine them into one lower monthly payment with zero credit impact. And savings can start the same day the 30-second assessment is completed. If there's a balance sitting on credit cards right now, interest charges are adding up every single day. PDS Debt offers a way to finally take control, and there's no minimum credit score required. PDS Debt is one of the top-rated companies in the industry, with thousands of 5-star reviews and an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. Get your free 30-second personalized assessment today at pdsdebt.com/MrBallin. On the afternoon of June 12, 1962, an 18-year-old boy named George Jr. drove through his hometown of Modesto, California, on his way home for dinner. But as he was driving, George Jr. could not help but feel like he was really dreading actually getting there. So he and his father had been fighting a lot lately, ever since he had told his dad that he did not want to go to college, and instead he wanted to become a race car driver. And his dad thought this was a ridiculous idea and that George Jr. was wasting his potential. So George Jr. was a very smart kid. In particular, he was very good at art and photography, but he also got distracted really easily, and because of that, he really had not pursued anything all that seriously at any point in his life. That is, except for cars. A few years back, George Jr. had begun hanging around mechanic shops and sort of fell in love with cars. He thought they were fascinating. And at that point, his father actually bought him a small Italian car called a Fiat. And George Jr., after getting this car, sort of became obsessed with it, and he wound up souping up the engine and basically turned this little car into sort of like a race car. And he'd actually begun entering his little car into local car races. and he'd actually even won a few of these races. But his father, despite being the one who literally gave him the Fiat, he just didn't get his son's obsession with cars. Like, why aren't you able to, take that focus and apply it to other things, that will get you a real job and give you a real future? And so basically every dinner these days, it became this huge argument between father and son. But, George Jr., as frustrated as he was with the whole situation, couldn't really change it, at least not for now, because he still lived with his parents, and so he just had to accept that if they were going to fight, they were going to fight. And so George, he came to this intersection where it was right near his home. He just needed to make a left and, pull over, and he was home. He comes to a stop, he puts on his blinker, and he begins making the turn when he hears this really loud screeching sound and then feels his own car jolt forward, and then everything went black. 2 weeks later, George Jr. was laying in a hospital bed in the intensive care unit at the local hospital, watching daytime reruns on the TV in his room. He was in so much pain that he could barely move, so all he did was just watch TV. So 2 weeks earlier, when George was, making that turn and then something happened, well, what it was is another car came speeding down the road and smashed into George's car so hard that it sent his car, his little Fiat, flying, and it flipped 3 times. And while it was flipping, George Jr. was ejected from the car, and actually it saved his life because the moment he was ejected, his car smashed into a tree and sort of wrapped around it. I mean, George was very badly hurt. He had multiple bone fractures, bruised lungs. I mean, he was really beaten up. But he had survived. However, the doctors told him that because of how extensive his injuries were, he would basically be recovering in bed in the hospital for months. But again, George Jr. just felt lucky to be alive at this point. And really, as he laid in bed, watching TV and just sort of stuck there, he began to think that, maybe this is my wake-up call. Maybe I do need to make some changes in my life. 2 years later, George Jr., who by this point was fully recovered from his injuries, stood at the finish line at a racetrack and raised his camera. And the race cars came whipping toward him on their last lap, and he snapped the photo finish. So since his near-death experience, George Jr. had made some big decisions. In the hospital after his accident, he had realized that really, his dad had been kind of right, that in some ways he was wasting his potential. So after getting out of the hospital, George Jr. had enrolled in community college, and he really applied himself to his schoolwork, to the point where his father was really impressed. Also, George Jr. had decided that he really didn't want to race cars anymore. He loved cars still, but it just felt like it was sort of reckless and not so much his thing anymore. Instead, he had, along with, focusing on his schoolwork, he had also picked up his camera and really gotten back into his old hobby of photography. In fact, George Jr. had grown to love photography so much that after community college, he had applied to the prestigious cinematography program at the University of Southern California. But after sending off his application, he was pretty sure he would not get in, because despite his efforts with his schoolwork at community college, he still knew his grades likely were not up to snuff. Now, George Jr. walked over to the podium to take some photos of the winning driver. But as he walked over there, this middle-aged man came up beside him and just asked George Jr. about his photography. They spoke for a few minutes, and then at some point, the man actually formally introduced himself as Haskell Wexler. And he said that he was actually a cinematographer in Hollywood. And George Jr., when he heard this, he sort of felt starstruck. And he told Haskell about how he had recently applied to USC to try to get into their cinematography program, but he felt like it was kind of a long shot. And when Haskell heard this, he said, "George, I know people at USC. Let me make some calls. I'll get you in." And sure enough, not long after this fateful meeting, George Jr. would receive an acceptance letter from USC's film school. But this moment in George Jr.'s life, receiving this unbelievable acceptance letter, did not just alter George's life forever. It also would go on to completely alter cinema in general forever. Because about 13 years later, George Jr. would go on to create one of the most groundbreaking films in history. His movie revolutionized sound design and visual effects, and it would go on to become part of the most successful movie franchise of all time. George Jr. is better known today as George Lucas, and his film franchise was Star Wars. On a Sunday evening in the spring of 1938, 8-year-old Carolyn Jones hurried after her mother as they both carried platters of food down a street in Amarillo, Texas. It was Easter Sunday, and Carolyn and her mother were going to their neighbor's house to celebrate the holiday. Carolyn's dad was not in the picture, so when they had moved into this neighborhood a few years ago, Carolyn's mom had made a big effort to get to know their neighbors to make sure that they had a lot of friends and community and support around them. And so as a result, Carolyn's mom had actually really bonded with a specific middle-aged couple whose name was Mr. and Mrs. Franklin that lived right down the street. And that's whose house they were going to right now. And Carolyn was really excited because the Franklins had always been so nice to her, and this holiday dinner usually meant sweets and some fun Easter games like decorating eggs. Less than an hour later, Carolyn, her mother, and the Franklins were all sitting around the table eating some food. The grown-ups were having a very animated discussion about something very boring, and Carolyn was feeling just completely antsy. She just wanted this very boring adult part of the evening to end so she could have some candy and go play. And so while she's feeling this way, the phone rang in the Franklin's house. And since the grown-ups were very busy talking, Mrs. Franklin asked Carolyn if she wouldn't mind going and answering the phone and seeing who it was. So Carolyn, who was excited to have really anything to do at this point, she jumped up and she grabbed the phone and said, "Hello." And on the other end was an operator who said this was a collect call coming in from somebody named Joyce. Carolyn knew that Joyce was the Franklin's adult daughter. And also Carolyn knew from her own mother that Joyce had moved away a few years ago to go to school in Missouri. So when Carolyn heard this, she called over to the table and said there was a collect call coming in from Joyce. But when she did this, the room, which just a second ago had been, sort of noisy as the adults were chatting the whole time, the room went completely silent. Mr. and Mrs. Franklin just stared at Carolyn, and to Carolyn's surprise, they sort of looked mad. Then Mr. Franklin got up and he walked over to Carolyn and sort of aggressively took the phone out of Carolyn's hand, and then to the operator, he said, "Put the call through." Carolyn felt like she'd done something wrong, but she had no idea what. So she was just feeling totally shocked and embarrassed and just kind of stepped aside to watch Mr. Franklin as he listened to the caller speak. It would turn out that in past years, at Easter dinners before this one, the Franklin's daughter, Joyce, would always make the drive home from her school in Missouri to be with her parents in Texas. And in years past, when she couldn't make the trip, she had always been really good about calling her parents and letting them know. And that was what Joyce had been calling about that night. When her father answered the phone and Joyce was put through, she said, "Daddy, I can't get home." But this year, Joyce's call was not routine. In fact, it was like the single most shocking thing that could have happened. Because a year earlier, during last Easter, when Joyce had been literally on her way home from school to see her parents, she'd gotten in a car accident and died. No one was ever able to explain that phone call, but the experience of being the one who actually answered the phone and being there when Mr. Franklin's face went white and he fainted, like that experience for 8-year-old Carolyn was incredibly formative. In fact, in many ways, it's like her life changed in that exact moment. And from that point forward, Carolyn really went on to fully embrace the macabre in her life. And through that, she ultimately became a very famous actress and scream queen, appearing in dozens of thrillers and horror films. Her most iconic macabre role was being Morticia Addams in the original Addams Family TV series.
Imagine you have that one friend in your group who is just the absolute golden retriever of the bunch. The guy who is always 5 minutes early, the one who calls his family every single week just to chat, the one who thrives on a steady, comforting routine and never does anything reckless. That was 22-year-old Trevor Deely. It was early December in the year 2000, and the city of Dublin, Ireland was absolutely buzzing with that infectious, chaotic holiday energy. Trevor, an incredibly reliable young guy working in the information technology department of a major bank, was totally wrapped up in the festive spirit. On this particular Thursday night, his office was throwing their annual Christmas party. It started at a nice local restaurant and eventually migrated to a loud-packed nightclub. Trevor was in exceptionally high spirits, dressed super sharp in a yellow and brown shirt, just laughing his head off and celebrating a year of hard work with his favorite colleagues. His life was perfectly orderly and deeply peaceful, which makes the utter nightmare of what happened next feel so incredibly wrong. As the hours ticked by and the music pounded inside the club, the weather outside was turning violently hostile. A massive winter storm was ripping through Dublin. The wind was absolutely howling down the narrow cobblestone streets, carrying sheets of freezing, relentless rain. And just to make the situation completely unmanageable, a citywide taxi strike was happening that exact same night. If you were out late, you were entirely out of luck. You had to brave that miserable biting storm on foot. Around 3:30 in the morning, Trevor finally decided he was totally exhausted. He gave out his hugs, yelled his goodbyes over the loud music, and stepped out of the sweltering club directly into a freezing wall of water. His apartment was not impossibly far away, but walking through that kind of torrential downpour without a proper winter coat was going to be pure agony. He suddenly remembered he had left his massive, heavy-duty golf umbrella at his office desk, which was really just a short detour away. Trevor simply pulled his collar up against the stinging wind, put his head down, and started walking toward the bank, dreaming of his warm blankets, completely unaware that his ordinary life was already over. At exactly 3:35 in the morning, Trevor approaches the heavy iron gates of his office building. The streets are entirely empty, completely washed out by the brutal winter storm. But as he walks up to scan his security badge, he notices something deeply unsettling. Standing perfectly still in the freezing pouring rain just outside the perimeter of the gate is a man dressed entirely in dark clothing. He isn't huddled under an awning seeking shelter. He isn't pacing around trying to hail a non-existent cab. He is just standing there, letting the freezing water absolutely soak into his dark clothes, staring out at the wet street. Most people would have their alarm bells ringing instantly, but you have to remember, Trevor is a nice, trusting guy living in a major metropolitan city. Seeing someone acting a little eccentric at 3 in the morning isn't totally out of the realm of possibility. Trevor doesn't seem panicked at all. He just casually walks right past this shadowy figure, swipes his keycard, and waits for the heavy gate to click open. The man in black doesn't say a single word. He doesn't even flinch. Trevor slips inside the gate, locks securely behind him, and he walks into the bright, warm, beautifully lit lobby of his workplace to escape the freezing storm. He is safe. Inside, everything is totally normal. He makes himself a quick cup of hot tea to thaw out his freezing hands. He logs into his computer for a few minutes, likely checking his emails or wrapping up a minor task he had suddenly remembered. He finds his massive corporate golf umbrella right where he left it. While he is sipping his tea, a coworker working the late-night shift spots him. They have a totally normal, friendly little chat. The coworker later notes that Trevor was in a fantastic mood, completely relaxed and showing absolutely zero signs of stress or fear. He was just a guy killing a few minutes before braving the storm again. But what Trevor doesn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend as he finishes his tea and grabs his umbrella, is that the strange man outside the gate hasn't left. He is still out there hiding in the deep, wet shadows, waiting patiently for the exact moment Trevor steps back out into the dark. At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, Trevor decides he really needs to get home and get to sleep. He grabs his umbrella, waves a cheerful goodnight to his coworker, and heads back out the glass front doors. As he walks toward the exterior security gate, a camera catches him, opening his large umbrella, shielding his face from the torrential downpour. But the man in black is still out there. He has shifted his position slightly, hovering right on the absolute edge of the camera's view, blending seamlessly into the heavy, rainy darkness. As Trevor steps out onto the wet sidewalk, the footage captures something incredibly brief but totally chilling. The two of them seem to have a momentary interaction. Maybe Trevor politely nodded, or maybe the dark figure mumbled something to him over the sound of the rain. It lasts only a few fleeting seconds, and Trevor's body language does not change at all. He doesn't look startled, he doesn't step back in fear. He simply adjusts his grip on the heavy umbrella, turns his back to the man, and begins his final walk home, leaning hard into the brutal winter wind. As he trudges down the empty, glistening street, Trevor actually pulls out his mobile phone. He is in such a genuinely good mood that he decides to dial the number of one of his best friends just to check in. Because it is so unbelievably late, his friend is obviously fast asleep, and the call goes straight to voicemail. The message Trevor leaves is absolutely heartbreaking when you know the reality of what happens next. You can hear the cheerful, sleepy exhaustion in his voice. He laughs, mentions what an awesome night they had out, complains a little bit about the awful storm he is walking through, and promises to catch up later. His voice is perfectly calm, light, and completely happy. He is just a tired young professional walking home in the rain. He isn't looking over his shoulder. He isn't rushing his steps in a panic. He is completely terrifyingly oblivious to the fact that right behind him, just out of his line of sight, the man in black has begun to move. The dark figure has perfectly matched Trevor's pace, quietly stepping out of the deep shadows and following him down the desolate, rain-slicked pavement. Just 14 minutes later, at exactly 4:14 in the morning, Trevor is approaching a very quiet intersection on Haddington Road. Right on the corner, built into the side of a brick bank branch, is an automated teller machine with a security camera pointing straight down at the sidewalk. The black and white footage pulled from this exact camera is the stuff of actual nightmares. The screen shows the heavy rain violently slashing sideways across the empty street, glowing under the harsh light of a single street lamp. Then Trevor walks right into the frame. He is keeping a steady, determined pace, holding his large corporate umbrella incredibly low to block the freezing wind from hitting his face. He marches directly past the lens, looking exactly like anyone else, just desperate to escape the miserable weather, and vanishes into the pitch-black darkness beyond the camera's reach. For about 30 agonizing seconds, the street is completely dead again. Nothing but the pouring rain hitting the pavement. But then a subtle movement catches the very edge of the frame. A figure violently steps into view, walking the exact same path Trevor just took. It is the man in black, but his demeanor has completely changed. He is walking at a brisk, heavily aggressive pace, his shoulders hunched tight, his hands shoved deeply into his dark pockets. He doesn't have an umbrella, and he doesn't seem to care at all that the freezing water is completely drenching his clothes. He is staring dead ahead, absolutely locked onto his target, trailing just seconds behind Trevor into the dark. We know this was a targeted hunt because 17 agonizing years later, when experts used highly advanced digital software to clean up the grainy footage from outside Trevor's office, they made a blood-curdling discovery. By scrubbing back the timeline, they realized the dark figure hadn't just been wandering past the office by coincidence. The newly enhanced video proved the man had arrived at the gate 30 full minutes before Trevor ever showed up. He had stood completely still in a freezing, torrential winter storm, letting the ice and rain batter his body, just waiting. When Trevor went inside to get his umbrella, the man patiently waited in the shadows. He wasn't a random passerby. He was a predator who had meticulously set a trap. After the dark figure walked past that bank machine and disappeared into the exact same shadows that had just swallowed Trevor, the timeline of Trevor Deely's life simply ceases to exist. He never unlocked the door to his warm apartment that night. He never showed up to his IT job on Monday morning, a terrifying fact that sent a shockwave of immediate blinding panic through his friends, who knew that Trevor was never, ever late for anything. His mobile phone never pinged off another cellular tower. His bank accounts remained perfectly frozen, completely untouched from that night forward. He had just evaporated into the storm. His frantic family and friends launched a massive, desperate search, plastering his smiling face on posters across every single corner of the entire country. They dragged the freezing canals, scoured the local parks, and begged anyone with information to come forward. But the city had swallowed him whole. It was as if that brutal winter storm had literally washed away every single physical trace of his existence, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a grainy, degraded VHS tape. The investigators practically begged the man in the video to just come forward and clear his name to eliminate himself from the inquiry, but nobody ever called in. The hunter in the dark clothes remained a complete phantom, a faceless blur of pixels who somehow pulled off the impossible. The absolute terror of this story isn't just about a bright, wonderful young man vanishing into thin air. It is about the agonizing realization of what those final moments must have been like in the pitch black. Trevor was walking home, feeling completely wrapped in the safety of his hometown, thinking about his warm bed and his family, totally unaware that the man he politely nodded to was silently closing the distance behind him. Somewhere in the dark, rainy expanse of that massive city, completely out of the view of any security cameras, the hunter finally caught up to his prey. To this day, Trevor has never been found, and the man in black has never been identified. It leaves us with a haunting, terrifying truth. Sometimes the monster isn't hiding under the bed. Sometimes he is just waiting patiently in the freezing rain, watching you walk right into the dark. At roughly 8 o'clock in the evening on a quiet Thursday in May of 1995, an elegant young woman rested inside room 2805 of the Oslo Plaza Hotel. This towering skyscraper in Norway was the absolute crown jewel of the city, renowned for its modern security and breathtaking views. It was the kind of place where diplomats and international executives stayed to guarantee their privacy, creating a fortress of absolute quiet and anonymity. The woman checked in 2 days prior under the name Jennifer Fairgate. She possessed a striking, confident demeanor, speaking fluent English with a very slight European accent. When she approached the front desk, the staff were so taken by her polished appearance they bypassed standard security protocols. They handed over the room keys without ever asking for her passport, a physical identification card, or even a credit card to hold on file for the security deposit. For the next 48 hours, she essentially vanished into the luxury of the 28th floor. The heavy, solid wooden doors and thick hallway carpets absorbed almost all the ambient noise, creating a pocket of deep isolation high above the bustling streets of Oslo. She hung a "Please do not disturb" sign on her doorknob and rarely ventured out into the city. She treated this incredibly expensive room as a sanctuary, entirely shutting the rest of the outside world away. The few times she interacted with the hotel staff, she was completely ordinary. Room service delivered a hot meal on Wednesday evening, and the attendant noted she tipped very well. However, she kept the brief interaction incredibly guarded, standing half hidden in the shadows behind the heavy door while she accepted the tray. She did not make small talk or ask any questions about the city. She simply took her food, smiled politely, and closed the door until it firmly clicked. By Thursday evening, the hotel administration realized their mistake. A front desk cashier reviewing the guest ledger noticed that room 2805 had been occupied for 2 days without any method of payment secured on file. The room charges were slowly climbing, and it was strictly against hotel policy to let a guest stay this long without a deposit. They decided to send a young security guard up to the room to politely ask the woman to visit the front lobby desk. The young guard rode the silent elevator up to the 28th floor. When the polished metal doors slid open, he stepped out into the completely empty, brightly lit hallway. Everything felt perfectly calm and exceptionally safe. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only sound echoing in the long corridor. He walked down the thick carpet, checking the small brass numbers on the doors until he arrived right outside of room 2805, standing in the quiet. He stood perfectly still for a moment, listening to see if he could hear the television or any movement inside, but the heavy door blocked out everything. It was entirely silent. He raised his hand and knocked his knuckles firmly against the polished wood. He waited a few seconds, expecting to hear footsteps approaching from the other side. Instead, what happened next shattered the tranquil safety of the hotel floor and plunged the entire massive building into absolute blind chaos. Less than 2 seconds after the guard knocked on the door, a massive, deafening gunshot rang out from inside the room. The explosive sound was so incredibly loud and unexpected it physically rattled the heavy door in its frame. The guard instinctively ducked his heart, instantly hammering against his ribs as a wave of cold terror washed over him. He pressed his back tightly against the hallway wall, his breathing turning fast and shallow as he stared in total shock at the wood. He waited for another shot or for the door to suddenly fly open, but there was only a horrifying, ringing silence. His throat went completely dry. He was entirely unarmed, standing alone in a confined hallway with someone who had just fired a high-caliber weapon mere inches away from his face. Panic completely took over his body. Rather than staying to see what would happen next, the young guard turned around and sprinted down the hallway to find backup and call the local police. This decision to retreat, while completely understandable for an unarmed hotel employee, created a massive blind spot in the timeline. For the next 15 minutes, room 2805 was left entirely unmonitored. No one was standing guard in the hallway. No one was watching the service elevators or the emergency stairwell located just a few feet away from her door. When the armed Norwegian police finally arrived and rushed up to the 28th floor, the hall was empty. The police officers approached the room with their weapons drawn, treating it as an active and highly dangerous situation. They tried the door handle, but it was completely locked. The chief security officer used a master keycard to bypass the electronic lock, but the door still refused to open. It was secured by the manual interior deadbolt. To the armed officers standing in the hallway, this immediately signaled one incredibly specific thing. Whoever fired the gun was still inside. The officers forcefully breached the heavy door, throwing it open and rushing into the dark, quiet suite. The heavy curtains were drawn tightly shut, plunging the space into deep shadows. The sharp metallic smell of copper and the burnt chemical odor of cordite hung thickly in the air, burning the backs of their throats. They quickly cleared the small bathroom and the closet, finding them completely empty. Then their flashlights swept across the massive, empty, king-sized bed. The young woman who called herself Jennifer Fairgate was lying on her back, completely motionless. A massive, fatal gunshot wound to her forehead had ended her life instantly. In her right hand, resting strangely against her chest, was a dark metal 9mm Browning pistol. The room was perfectly intact. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, and no forced entry. The door had been double-locked from the inside. It looked like a tragic textbook suicide. But as the investigators began to slowly process the scene, the overwhelming feeling that something was deeply wrong began to creep into the room. The lead detective began searching her belongings, looking for a driver's license, a passport, or any kind of identification to notify her family. He checked the bedside tables, the heavy wooden desk, and the pockets of the dark clothing folded neatly in the closet. He opened her small leather travel bag, but he found absolutely nothing. She did not have a wallet, she did not have a passport, she had absolutely zero credit cards, no cash, and no keys to a house or a car. The police searched the bathroom and realized she did not even have a toothbrush, hairbrush, or any basic cosmetics. A woman had checked into a luxury hotel for a multi-day stay in a foreign country without bringing a single item that proved she existed. The detectives realized that Jennifer Fairgate was a completely fabricated phantom identity. The mystery escalated into something incredibly sinister when the crime scene technicians began examining the few articles of clothing she did bring with her. As they cataloged the dark trousers, the elegant blouses, and the jackets hanging in the closet, they made a terrifying discovery. Every single manufacturer tag, laundry mark, and brand label had been meticulously sliced off. Someone had taken a razor blade or small scissors and carefully erased the history of every garment. This was not a casual action. It requires intense dedication to remove the tiny inner tags of trousers and the delicate stitching of a blouse collar without damaging the fabric. The only piece of clothing that still had a label was a dark blazer made by a specific German designer, but it was an extremely common brand that offered no solid clues. Someone had gone through extraordinary painstaking lengths to ensure this woman could never be traced back to her country of origin. The detectives then turned their attention to the murder weapon resting on her chest. It was a powerful military-grade Browning 9mm pistol. When the forensic team carefully lifted it to record the serial number, they found another chilling detail. The metal where the serial number should have been stamped had been professionally dissolved with a highly corrosive acid. The numbers were completely eaten away, ensuring the weapon could never be tracked to a buyer or a seller. Next to the heavy wooden desk, the police found a small, dark briefcase. When they clicked the latches open, they expected to find her missing identification or perhaps a suicide note. Instead, they found 25 rounds of loose 9mm ammunition sitting inside. There was absolutely nothing else in the briefcase, just a heavy pile of bullets. It was an astonishing amount of extra ammunition for someone who supposedly checked into a hotel room just to end their own life. As the medical examiner took over the physical evidence of the supposed suicide completely fell apart, the way the woman was holding the gun defied gravity. After a person suffers a sudden catastrophic head wound, all their muscles instantly relax. The heavy metal pistol should have slipped from her fingers and fallen onto the bed or the floor. Instead, her thumb was resting on the trigger and her hand was balanced on her chest in a completely unnatural, rigid position. Furthermore, firing a 9mm pistol causes a massive microscopic explosion, ejecting burning powder and chemical residue backward onto the hands of the shooter. But when they tested the young woman's skin, they found absolutely zero gunshot residue. There was also a complete lack of blood spatter on the hand holding the weapon. The forensic experts concluded that it was physically impossible for this woman to have pulled the trigger herself. She had been murdered. But this realization crashed headfirst into the most terrifying and impossible fact of the entire investigation. The heavy hotel door had been double-locked from the inside. When the police breached the room, the physical deadbolt was fully engaged. There were no balconies and the window was locked from the inside high up on the 28th floor. It was a perfect textbook locked room mystery. If an assassin shot her, how did they leave the room and lock the door from within? Investigators began looking deeply into the 15-minute window where the young security guard had run downstairs in terror. That was the only possible time frame the killer had to escape. The prevailing theory was that the assassin was already in the room when the guard knocked. To avoid being discovered, the killer fired the gun to scare the guard away. Once the hallway was clear, they arranged the body, wiped the room of evidence, and utilized a highly sophisticated exit strategy. Intelligence experts suggest the killer used a specialized tool to reach under the door crack or manipulate the deadbolt from the outside after pulling the door shut. It is a technique taught almost exclusively to high-level government operatives and international intelligence agencies. The complete erasure of her identity, the acid-washed gun, and the locked room escape all pointed to one chilling conclusion. This was not a standard murder. It was a professional state assassination. Norwegian intelligence services eventually took over the investigation, suspecting she was a compromised covert agent. They scoured international databases and sent her fingerprints across the globe, but no one ever came forward. Her family never reported her missing, and her government never claimed her. A year later, she was buried in an anonymous grave. The police kept tissue samples in deep storage, hoping advancing technology might one day pierce the veil of secrecy around her life. In the year 2017, investigators exhumed her body to utilize modern scientific techniques that did not exist in the 1990s. They extracted a microscopic sample of enamel from her teeth and subjected it to complex isotope analysis, which tracks the chemical signatures of local drinking water. The results proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that she had spent her childhood and early adult years living in a very specific region of East Germany. Despite this massive scientific breakthrough, she has never been officially identified by name. The case remains open, a haunting reminder of the invisible wars fought in the quiet, carpeted hallways of luxury hotels. Somewhere in the world, a highly trained assassin knows exactly who she was and exactly how they managed to dissolve a serial number, wipe away all the evidence, and walk backward out of a heavy wooden door, locking the deadbolt from the inside before disappearing. To vanish into thin air from a sealed room leaves behind a lingering, claustrophobic dread. It is the terrifying reality that even behind double-locked doors, you are not truly safe if the person hunting you knows how to become a ghost. But what happens when the threat is not a hidden assassin with a gun, but a silent force of nature? We shift from an invisible killer leaving no trace in a hotel room to an invisible killer sweeping through an entire valley without leaving a footprint. At roughly 8 o'clock in the evening on Thursday, August 21st, 1986, the lush green valleys beneath the volcanic crater of Lake Nyos in Cameroon were settling into a peaceful dusk. Over 1,700 villagers, spread across 3 traditional farming communities, were wrapping up their daily chores. The air was warm and still filled, only with the familiar comforting sounds of crickets and livestock settling down for the long night ahead. The centerpiece of this entire region was the lake itself. Nestled high up in the mountains, Lake Nyos was a stunningly beautiful body of water, known for its crystal blue color and perfectly calm surface. It sat completely undisturbed inside the ancient caldera of a dormant volcano. For generations, the people living in the valleys below relied on the fertile volcanic soil, treating the towering crater as a quiet, protective guardian watching over their homes. In the village of Lower Nyos, a cattle farmer named Ephraim was sitting outside his modest clay brick home, resting his tired legs after a long day of tending to his massive herd. Small campfires dotted the valley floor, glowing warmly in the darkening jungle. Children were being tucked into their beds, and the adults were sharing their evening meals. It was a community deeply connected to nature, where every normal sound of the forest was intimately understood. The lake high above them was completely silent, reflecting the emerging starlight. But deep beneath that tranquil blue surface, hundreds of feet down in the pitch-black water, a massive, invisible reservoir of volcanic gas had been building up for decades. It was trapped by the immense crushing pressure of the deep water above it, compressed into the cold depths like a tightly coiled spring, just waiting for the slightest disturbance to finally break it free. Around 9 o'clock, the perfect peace of the valley was broken by a strange low rumbling sound echoing down from the mountain. It sounded somewhat like distant thunder, but when the villagers looked up, the night sky was entirely clear and full of stars. There were no storm clouds anywhere to be seen. The ground did not shake. The rumble was deeply unnerving because it seemed to be coming from inside the earth itself rather than from the sky above them. A few minutes after the rumbling stopped, a strange and pungent odor began to drift down the mountain slopes. It smelled faintly of sulfur, reminiscent of rotten eggs or recently fired gunpowder. The villagers sniffed the air, confused and becoming slightly anxious. In a region entirely dependent on nature, an unrecognizable smell usually meant something was wrong. Some people stepped out of their homes to look up the mountain, trying to spot a wildfire in the dark. But there was no fire. Instead, those with a clear view up the valley might have noticed a strange pale mist beginning to spill over the rocky lip of the crater. It did not behave like normal weather. Instead of rising or dissipating into the warm night air, this mist was incredibly heavy. It hugged the ground tightly, pouring over the edge of the crater like a slow, completely silent waterfall of thick white foam descending directly into the deep valleys below. At the very edge of the lake, an unimaginable physical transformation had already taken place. The normally pristine crystal blue water had violently churned and turned a deep muddy blood, red color. The deep waters had rapidly turned over, bringing ancient iron deposits and millions of tons of compressed carbon dioxide instantly to the surface. The lake had essentially burst open from the bottom up, completely silently and without any explosive fiery force. The heavy white cloud pouring down the mountain was moving at nearly 30 miles an hour, but it made absolutely no sound as it rolled through the trees. It was an avalanche of dense gas, roughly 150 feet thick, entirely composed of pure carbon dioxide. Because carbon dioxide is significantly heavier than the oxygen we breathe, the massive cloud pushed all the breathable air up and away as it violently displaced the atmosphere in the valleys below. Down in the village, Ephraim felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of extreme fatigue wash over him. His heartbeat started racing wildly in his chest, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. His breathing became incredibly rapid, but his lungs felt completely empty, as if the air itself had suddenly lost all of its substance. He tried to stand up, but his legs were terribly weak and shaking violently. His throat went bone dry as panic began to set in. A deep, heavy warmth spread through his chest, followed quickly by a dizzying sense of confusion. He did not feel any sharp pain, only an overwhelming absolute exhaustion pulling him down into the dirt. All across the valley, the small campfires began to instantly snuff out. They were not blown away by a heavy wind, nor were they put out by a sudden downpour of rain. The bright orange flames simply shrank down to nothing and vanished in a single second. The fires were completely starved of oxygen, their glowing embers fading to dark gray ash almost immediately. In the span of a few terrifying moments, the entire valley was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. People sitting around their evening meals mid-sentence simply slumped over onto the ground. Children sleeping peacefully in their beds never woke up. The massive herds of cattle grazing quietly in the fenced pastures collapsed entirely where they stood. There was absolutely no panic, no screaming, and no frantic running for the hills. The invisible cloud simply blanketed the earth, quietly turning off the switch of life for every single mammal it touched. Ephraim somehow managed to crawl to slightly higher ground on a small dirt ridge just above his home before he completely lost consciousness. He collapsed face first into the soil, entirely unaware of the absolute devastation unfolding just a few yards below him. The massive, heavy cloud of gas settled into the lowest points of the valley, filling the homes, the cattle pens, and the winding dirt roads. It sat there like an invisible, suffocating ocean in the middle of the jungle. It lingered for hours in the dark, ensuring that nothing trapped beneath its surface could take a single breath. Then slowly, as the night wore on, the normal atmospheric winds began to gently push the deadly carbon dioxide apart, dispersing it. The next morning, the bright African sun rose over the beautiful green mountains, shining down on a landscape that looked perfectly normal from a distance. The trees were lush and swaying in the gentle morning breeze. The roofs of the village houses were perfectly intact. But as Ephraim slowly woke up on the small ridge, his head pounding with a severe throbbing pain, he immediately realized that something was horrifyingly wrong with the quiet world around him. The morning air was dead silent. There were no roosters crowing to greet the rising sun. There were no dogs barking in the distance, and absolutely no voices calling out across the valley. Ephraim stood up on his shaky legs, his throat incredibly dry and burning, and looked down toward his family property. The sight that met his eyes was so profoundly unnatural that for a long moment his brain simply refused to process what he was looking at in the bright daylight. His entire massive herd of hundreds of cattle was dead, lying flat on the green grass without a single mark on them. He frantically stumbled down the hill into the village to find his neighbors, but the nightmare only deepened. Every single person he found was deceased. They were lying in their doorways, resting in their beds, or sprawled in the dirt exactly where they had been sitting the night before. There was no blood and absolutely no visible trauma. It looked exactly like a scene from a terrifying science fiction film. When authorities and medical rescuers finally arrived from neighboring regions days later, they were completely paralyzed by fear and confusion. They walked through the village with thick cloths pressed tightly over their mouths, terrified of catching a deadly airborne plague. But this was clearly no plague. Everything mechanical and structural was perfectly fine. The plants were incredibly healthy. The terrifying mystery only deepened when the investigators noticed something incredibly bizarre about the local wildlife. The flies, mosquitoes, and ground-dwelling insects were completely dead, scattered across the dirt like thrown sand. But high up in the towering canopy of the jungle trees, small birds were singing happily. Scavenger birds that had flown into the valley that very morning were perfectly healthy, landing safely on the roofs of the silent houses. Panic quickly spread across the country and the international community. Foreign governments feared that a rogue nation had secretly tested a highly advanced covert biological weapon in the isolated valley. The sheer scale of the death, combined with the absolute lack of physical damage to the environment, pointed to a horrific military strike. Scientists and elite geologists from around the world rushed to the remote crater lake to find the hidden truth. When the scientists hiked up the mountain and finally looked down into the caldera of Lake Nyos, they found the smoking gun. The normally gorgeous blue water was a murky, ugly rust red. The lake level had dropped significantly, and the surrounding trees near the water's edge were completely flattened, pushed outward by a massive surge of water and gas. They realized they were not looking at a military attack, but a terrifying and exceedingly rare natural phenomenon. They diagnosed the devastating event as a limnic eruption. For decades, carbon dioxide from the volcanic magma deep within the Earth had been slowly leaking into the bottom of the lake. Because the water was so incredibly deep and highly pressurized, the gas dissolved directly into the cold water instead of bubbling up to the surface. It acted exactly like a violently shaken, unopened bottle of warm carbonated soda just waiting for a reason to finally explode. On that fateful night, something disrupted the delicate temperature balance of the lake. It could have been a small rock slide, a minor tremor, or simply a shift in the seasonal weather. Whatever the trigger was, it caused the deep gas heavy water to rise slightly. As it rose, the immense water pressure dropped, and the carbon dioxide violently exploded out of solution. The lake essentially let out a massive, catastrophic burp, releasing tons of gas at once. Because carbon dioxide is much denser than normal air, it did not float away into the atmosphere. It formed a massive, invisible wave that poured over the crater lip and rushed down into the valleys naturally, seeking the lowest possible ground. It blanketed the completely unaware villages in a heavy layer of pure suffocation. The people and animals simply breathed in, found absolutely no oxygen in the air, and lost consciousness in a matter of seconds. Over 1,700 human beings and 3,500 livestock perished overnight in one of the strangest natural disasters in recorded history. The sheer suddenness of the event left deep psychological scars on the few people who survived on the high ridges. They went to sleep in a vibrant, noisy farming community and woke up in a completely silent, perfectly preserved graveyard entirely untouched by human hands or conventional weapons of war. To prevent this invisible killer from ever returning, international engineering teams later installed massive degassing pipes straight into the deepest parts of Lake Nyos. These long vertical tubes act like giant straws, continuously pulling the gas-rich water to the surface where the carbon dioxide can safely and slowly vent into the open air. Today, a towering geyser of water constantly shoots into the sky above the lake, acting as a permanent safety exhaust valve. To be hunted by an invisible gas in the dark of night is a terrifying reminder of how vulnerable we are to the silent forces of nature. But what happens when the invisible threat does not hide in the shadows of an ancient volcano, but arrives in the light of day as a beautiful, mesmerizing object? We shift from a deadly, suffocating mist that leaves no physical trace to a glowing, magical powder that slowly burns everything it touches, from the inside out. At roughly 10 in the morning on a hot Tuesday in September of 1987, Roberto and Wagner were walking down a dusty street in the bustling city of Goiânia, Brazil. The two men were impoverished scrap metal scavengers, spending their days hunting through the sprawling urban landscape for anything of value. It was grueling, unglamorous work under the blistering South American sun, but it was honest. Scavenging was their primary livelihood. Finding a heavy piece of discarded iron or a spool of forgotten copper wire meant their families would eat a good meal that week. They knew every alleyway and every abandoned lot in their neighborhood. They were used to the heat, the dirt, and the endless walking. They lived a simple life entirely focused on providing for their children and surviving another day in the city. On this particular morning, their daily route took them past an old, partially demolished building sitting quietly behind a chain-link fence. It used to be a private radiotherapy clinic, but it had been abandoned for a long time due to a bitter legal dispute. The roof was partially caved in and the windows were shattered. To the average person passing by, it was just an ugly eyesore rotting away in the neighborhood. But to Roberto and Wagner, an abandoned medical facility was a potential gold mine. Old clinics were often filled with heavy metal fixtures, thick wiring, and expensive machinery left behind by bankrupt owners. The two men squeezed through a gap in the rusted fence and stepped into the shadowy, humid ruins of the building. The air inside smelled of damp concrete and old dust, completely still and entirely undisturbed. As they navigated through the dark, debris-filled hallways, they stumbled upon an absolute treasure in one of the rear treatment rooms. Sitting in the center of the floor was a massive, incredibly heavy machine made almost entirely of solid lead and steel. It was a teletherapy unit used years ago for treating cancer patients. The two men had no idea what it was, but they instantly recognized the immense value of the metal. It took them hours of backbreaking labor to dismantle the heavy casing. Sweating profusely in the stifling heat, they finally managed to pry open the core of the machine. Inside, they found a small heavy capsule made of steel and lead. It looked like a specialized mechanical component, dense and incredibly heavy for its small size. Thrilled with their massive haul, they loaded the capsule into a wheelbarrow and headed home. They took the capsule to Roberto's backyard, placing it under the shade of a large mango tree. For the next few days, they worked tirelessly with simple hand tools to break the small steel cylinder open, hoping to separate the valuable metals inside. It was incredibly tough, resisting their hammers and screwdrivers. But on the third day, a sharp blow finally cracked the thick casing, revealing a small window into the core. When they peered inside the crack, they saw something completely inexplicable. Deep within the core of the heavy metal capsule was a powdery substance that was emitting a faint, mesmerizing, glowing blue light. It did not look like any metal or chemical they had ever seen. The beautiful blue glow was entirely self-sustaining, shining softly in the dim light of the backyard without any batteries, wires, or heat source. Roberto took a long screwdriver and carefully scooped some of the strange powder out of the capsule. In the evening twilight, the glowing blue dust looked absolutely magical. It resembled a tiny cluster of glowing stars resting on the dirt. The two men were utterly captivated. They had no understanding of radiation or radioactive isotopes. They simply believed they had found something supernatural or perhaps highly valuable. That same evening, both men began to feel incredibly unwell. They developed intense headaches and severe nausea, vomiting multiple times throughout the night. They assumed it was simply food poisoning from something they ate for lunch, or perhaps exhaustion from working so hard in the brutal heat. They brushed off the symptoms, completely unaware that their bodies were being bombarded by massive lethal doses of gamma radiation. Despite feeling terribly sick, they needed money. They managed to load the broken capsule and the glowing powder into a wheelbarrow and rolled it down the street to a local junkyard. The junkyard was owned by a man named DeVere who purchased scrap metal from scavengers. When Roberto showed DeVere the broken capsule and the magical glowing blue dust inside the junkyard, owner was instantly fascinated by the strange object. DeVere bought the capsule and brought it directly into his own home. He placed the heavy metal object in his living room and waited for the sun to go down. When night fell, the blue glow became even more pronounced, illuminating the dark room with a beautiful, eerie light. DeVere was so amazed by the glowing powder that he invited his family, friends, and neighbors over to his house over the next few days to marvel at it. The glowing dust became a neighborhood sensation. DeVere scooped small pieces of the powder out and handed them to his friends as magical gifts. People held the glowing rocks in their bare hands, marveling at the unnatural light. Some people rubbed the dust on their skin, turning themselves into glowing figures in the dark, treating the deadly radioactive isotope like harmless carnival glitter or a fun luminous party trick. DeVere's brother came to visit and was given a small fragment of the glowing material. He took it back to his own house and showed it to his 6-year-old daughter. The little girl was absolutely enchanted by the glowing blue dust. She sat on the floor, playing with the powder with her bare hands while eating a sandwich. Every time she took a bite of her food, she was unknowingly ingesting massive amounts of radioactive material. By the end of the week, a terrifying and completely unexplainable medical crisis began to sweep through the tight-knit neighborhood. Dozens of people suddenly fell deathly ill. The local hospital emergency room started filling up with patients suffering from identical horrific symptoms. People were vomiting uncontrollably, experiencing extreme dizziness, and developing massive, painful, blistering burn lesions across their skin. The local doctors were completely baffled. The sheer number of patients arriving with these exact same bizarre symptoms made no sense. Because the victims were mostly poor scrap workers and their families, the doctors initially suspected a massive outbreak of a tropical disease or perhaps a severe batch of contaminated drinking water. No one in the city's medical community even considered the possibility of radiation poisoning. But DeVere's wife, a fiercely intelligent woman named Maria Gabriela, noticed a chilling pattern. Every single person who was violently ill, including her own husband and her extended family, had spent time in her living room over the past week. She realized the only new thing in their environment, the only object that connected all the dying people, was the strange glowing blue powder sitting heavily on her living room table. Maria Gabriela knew she had to get the strange object out of her house and into the hands of someone who could understand it. Despite feeling incredibly sick herself, she found a plastic bag and carefully placed the heavy metal capsule and the glowing dust inside it. She tied the bag shut, picked it up, and walked out of her home. She boarded a crowded public transit bus carrying the highly radioactive source in her bare hands. The bus ride took over 20 minutes, winding through the heavily populated streets of the city. Dozens of unaware passengers sat mere feet away from the deadly, unshielded capsule. Maria Gabriela rested the plastic bag on her lap, feeling a strange, unnatural warmth radiating through the thin plastic. Her skin was burning and her stomach was churning with intense nausea, but she forced herself to endure the agonizing journey. She finally arrived at the local health department office and practically threw the heavy plastic bag onto the front desk. She firmly told the medical staff that the glowing dust inside the bag was killing her family and poisoning her neighborhood. The doctors looked at the strange object in confusion. They still did not know what it was, but they placed it on a chair in the courtyard, keeping it away from the main patient wards. By pure luck, a visiting medical physicist happened to be in the city that day. When he heard rumors of a strange glowing powder causing mass burns, a cold spike of absolute terror hit his chest. He rushed to the health department with a Geiger counter. As he approached the building, still walking down the street, his equipment immediately maxed out the needle, slamming violently against the edge of the dial and screaming loudly. The physicist burst into the courtyard and realized the absolute catastrophe sitting in the plastic bag on the chair. The magical blue powder was cesium-137, a highly radioactive and incredibly dangerous isotope used in targeted cancer radiation therapy. The capsule was completely unshielded. The mesmerizing blue light was actually Cherenkov radiation, a visual byproduct of massive amounts of energy tearing through the air. Panic instantly swept through the government. They realized they were dealing with one of the worst radiological disasters in human history, outside of a nuclear power plant explosion. The entire city of Goiânia was thrown into a state of emergency. Hazardous material teams in heavy lead-lined suits descended upon the neighborhood, evacuating thousands of terrified citizens and scanning every single inch of the streets and homes. The situation was a complete nightmare. Because the glowing powder had been passed around by hand, blown by the wind, and tracked on the soles of people's shoes, the deadly contamination had spread everywhere. The government had to completely demolish several homes, tearing down the concrete and ripping up the topsoil, packing the radioactive rubble into thick lead drums to be buried deep underground in a secure waste facility. Despite the massive medical intervention, the damage had already been done. De Vere survived, but he lived the rest of his life plagued by deep depression and severe health issues, haunted by the fact that he brought the poison into his own home. 4 people died agonizing deaths in the weeks following the exposure, including the innocent 6-year-old girl who had sat on the floor eating her sandwich while playing with the magic dust. The bravest person in the entire tragedy, Maria Gabriella, also perished a month later. By placing the capsule in a bag and holding it on her lap during that terrible bus ride, she absorbed a massive fatal dose of radiation. But her actions undeniably saved the entire city. If she had not connected the sickness to the glowing powder and carried it to the hospital, the deadly dust would have continued to spread until thousands died. To this day, the empty lots where the contaminated homes used to stand serve as a chilling reminder of the disaster. It is a terrifying reality that an object of completely unimaginable danger was left unguarded in an empty building looking entirely ordinary until it was opened. The scavengers were not trying to build a weapon. They were just trying to feed their families, completely unaware that they were holding pure, invisible death. To be slowly killed by a beautiful, glowing object you brought into your own home is a deeply insidious nightmare. The danger is bright, mesmerizing, and entirely inescapable once it touches your skin. But what happens when the deadly threat does not come from a small, glowing rock in the heat, but from a massive illusion hidden in the sky? We shift from the sweltering, contaminated heat of a Brazilian city to the freezing, blinding white expanse of the Antarctic. At roughly 8 in the morning on Wednesday, November 28, 1979, 257 passengers and crew boarded Air New Zealand Flight 901. They were embarking on what the airline billed as the ultimate flight of a lifetime. It was a luxury sightseeing tour designed to fly down from Auckland, soar over the untouched frozen beauty of the Antarctic continent, and return home that very same evening. Inside the massive commercial aircraft, the atmosphere was incredibly festive and relaxed. Passengers were drinking champagne, chatting excitedly with their neighbors, and eagerly waiting to look out the windows at the frozen wasteland below. They were dressed in comfortable clothes, treating the airliner more like a giant flying cruise ship than a standard commuter flight. It was an expensive, highly sought-after ticket for a completely unique and thrilling vacation experience. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was equally calm and professional. The crew was led by Captain Jim Collins and First Officer Greg Casson. Both men were elite, highly experienced pilots with thousands of hours of flight time between them. They were meticulous professionals who had thoroughly briefed for this specific route. They were deeply familiar with the complex navigation systems required to safely pilot a massive aircraft over the magnetic extremes of the freezing South Pole. The flight plan they were following was a standard, pre-approved route that Air New Zealand had been flying safely for over 2 years. The computer coordinates were designed to take the plane directly down the center of McMurdo Sound. This was a massive, flat corridor of ice and water that provided a spectacular, perfectly safe viewing area. It kept the aircraft miles away from the dangerous, towering peaks of Mount Erebus, a massive, active volcano on Ross Island. For the first several hours of the journey, everything went absolutely perfectly. The massive jet cruised smoothly over the Southern Ocean, leaving the green landscapes of New Zealand far behind. As they finally approached the Antarctic coastline, the weather conditions were reported as generally clear, though a solid layer of white clouds sat relatively low in the sky. The passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts, getting their cameras completely ready for the upcoming view. Captain Collins decided to descend the aircraft below the cloud layer to give his passengers the breathtaking view they had paid for. This was a standard procedure for these specific flights, provided the automated navigation systems confirmed they were in the safe corridor of McMurdo Sound. The pilots verified their coordinates with the onboard computer. The glowing numbers assured them they were exactly where they were supposed to be, flying miles away from any high terrain. As the plane dropped out of the clouds, the view out the cockpit windows was slightly disorienting. The solid white overcast sky above perfectly matched the endless expanse of pure white snow directly below. The horizon line vanished completely, erasing the boundary between the ground and the air. It was a bizarre visual trick of the light, but the pilots were entirely unbothered. Their computer was flying the plane safely down the empty and visible highway they had thoroughly briefed on. Inside the cabin, the passengers were completely thrilled. They were snapping photographs through the small windows, capturing the endless white beauty of the frozen continent. The flight attendants were moving casually through the aisles. Up in the cockpit, Captain Collins and First Officer Casson were relaxed, chatting easily with the flight engineer. There was absolutely no sense of urgency, no frantic radio calls, and no warning lights flashing on the massive instrument panel. The cockpit voice recorder would later reveal how incredibly peaceful those final moments were. The crew was discussing the scenery, completely confident they were flying over the flat open water of the Sound. They were heavily trusting the advanced navigation system, guiding the autopilot. But hidden inside those digital coordinates was a terrifying fatal error. The plane was not flying down the flat corridor of McMurdo Sound. It was actually almost 30 miles entirely off course. Because of the bizarre lighting conditions outside, the pilots could not see that the flat white expanse in front of them was not the ocean. It was actually the gently sloping snow-covered base of Mount Erebus. The overcast clouds and the snow had created a rare atmospheric trap known as sector whiteout. There were no shadows, no contrast, and no visual depth. To the human eye, the towering volcano rising directly in their path looked exactly like flat, endless, empty ground. At 12:49 in the afternoon, the absolute tranquility of the flight deck was shattered by a deafening mechanical scream. The ground proximity warning system suddenly activated violently, blaring a loud alarm through the speakers. A robotic voice began shouting at the pilots to pull up immediately. The sudden noise was incredibly jarring, breaking the relaxed atmosphere. Captain Collins instantly grabbed the controls, his heart hammering as he tried to understand the loud alarm. He applied full thrust to the heavy engines and pulled back on the yoke, desperately trying to force the massive commercial airliner to climb into the sky. But it was far too late. They were flying at over 300 miles an hour, and the mountain they could not see was already right in front of them. Less than 6 seconds after the first warning alarm sounded, the massive jet slammed directly into the solid ice and rock of the towering Antarctic volcano. The impact was absolutely catastrophic. The massive aircraft disintegrated instantly upon hitting the lower slopes of Mount Erebus, creating a massive fireball that scorched the pristine white snow. The crash was so sudden and incredibly destructive that no one on board had any time to brace for impact. All 257 people on board died in a fraction of a second. The luxury flight of a lifetime had ended in one of the worst aviation disasters in modern history. When the plane failed to return to New Zealand that evening, search teams were immediately dispatched to the frozen continent. They quickly found the wreckage. The blackened scar on the side of the white volcano was highly visible from the air. When the first investigators were lowered down to the crash site, they were completely horrified by the sheer scale of the devastation. The massive debris field was scattered across hundreds of yards of freezing, completely unforgiving ice. As the terrifying news broke around the world, the immediate question on everyone's mind was how this could have possibly happened. The weather was generally clear, the plane was functioning perfectly, and the pilots were some of the absolute best in the industry. Airline executives quickly held a press conference and placed the blame entirely on Captain Collins. They confidently stated that the flight crew simply flew the plane far too low and made a terrible, fatal human mistake. The airline argued that the crew had become distracted by the sightseeing aspect of the flight and irresponsibly descended below safe altitude limits. They painted a picture of a careless crew flying an airliner like a bush plane directly into a mountain they should have easily seen. For the families of the dead pilots, this accusation was completely devastating. Their loved ones were not only gone, but their deeply respected professional reputations were being entirely destroyed. When the black boxes were finally recovered from the wreckage, the airline's official story began to show massive cracks. The voice recorder proved that the pilots were not acting recklessly. They were entirely focused on their instruments. They cross-checked their coordinates multiple times, and the flight computer confirmed they were flying safely down the middle of the flat sound. The pilots were not lost at all. The computer was telling them they were completely safe and on track. If the coordinates told the pilots they were safe but the plane was 30 miles off course, something had gone horribly wrong with the data. The government launched an inquiry to find the truth, appointing a highly respected judge named Peter Mahon to lead the investigation. Judge Mahon was known for his absolute refusal to be intimidated by powerful corporations, and he immediately began digging very deeply into the airline's heavily guarded internal flight planning records. What the judge uncovered was a secret so terrifying and grossly negligent it shook the aviation industry to its core. For over a year, the airline had been accidentally flying passengers on a path going directly over Mount Erebus rather than down the flat sound. The original coordinates typed into the mainframe were slightly off, placing planes dangerously close to the volcano. Previous crews survived this error only because they always flew in perfectly clear sunny weather conditions. Weeks before the flight took off, a navigator at the airline realized the mathematical error in the mainframe. He noticed the coordinates were pointing planes down the wrong path. Without making a major report, he quietly corrected the numbers in the central computer system, shifting the flight path by 2 degrees of longitude. This tiny digital adjustment moved the programmed destination exactly 27 miles east, placing it directly into the path of the massive, active volcano. The terrifying truth was that the airline updated the computer the night before Captain Collins arrived at the airport. When the pilots attended their briefing weeks earlier, they received the old coordinates pointing them down the flat corridor. But when they arrived on the morning of the crash, the ground computers automatically loaded the newly altered coordinates into the airplane. The airline never told the pilots about the massive midnight change to their designated flight plan. When Captain Collins checked his printouts against the cockpit computer, the numbers matched perfectly because the ground crew handed him a paper reflecting the new changes. He had absolutely no reason to suspect that the numbers he was looking at were pointing him directly into a 12,000-foot mountain. The crew took off completely unaware that their fate was entirely sealed before the massive jet engines had even spooled up on the busy commercial runway back in New Zealand. During the flight, the combination of the secret computer change and the terrifying natural illusion of sector whiteout created an inescapable trap. The pilots were flying exactly where their instruments told them to go, looking out the window at what appeared to be flat, endless ice. They were totally relaxed because they were doing their jobs perfectly. They died because they placed their absolute trust in a machine that their employer had quietly altered in the dead of the night. When Judge Mahon presented these terrifying findings, the airline desperately tried to cover it up. They shredded documents, hid flight plans, and continuously tried to shift the blame back onto the dead crew. The judge was so completely disgusted by the corporate cover-up that he published a scathing final report. He famously accused the airline executives of presenting an orchestrated litany of lies to the commission, effectively and permanently clearing the names of the dead flight crew. The Mount Erebus disaster remains one of the darkest chapters in aviation history. It is a haunting reminder that even the most experienced, highly trained professionals can be undone by a single hidden variable. 257 people lost their lives because a tiny digital number was changed in a dark office, thousands of miles away from the freezing, desolate slopes of the Antarctic volcano, where their journey came to such a sudden, incredibly violent, fiery end. To fly through the open sky and crash into a mountain you could not see is a terrifying disaster on a massive scale. It is a tragedy born from a secret change hidden deep within a computer, leading a large airplane entirely astray. But what happens when the deception is not built into a metal flight computer, but constructed completely out of human lies? We shift from a massive mechanical disaster seen from the sky to a quiet, invisible trap slowly closing in the Australian suburbs. At roughly 1:30 in the afternoon on Sunday, December 7, 2003, a 13-year-old boy named Daniel Morecambe was standing under a concrete overpass on the Sunshine Coast of Queensland, Australia. He was seeking shelter from the intermittent summer rain showers, waiting patiently for the local transit bus to arrive. Daniel was a remarkably polite and typical teenager who lived a quiet, entirely ordinary life with his loving parents and 2 brothers. He was known for his gentle nature and his deep affection for his family. On this particular Sunday, he was incredibly excited because he was heading to a nearby shopping mall to get a haircut and buy Christmas presents. The Sunshine Coast is renowned for its laid-back, relaxed atmosphere featuring beautiful beaches and tight-knit, incredibly safe suburban communities. It was the kind of place where kids regularly rode their bikes for miles without their parents worrying. Standing under the overpass, wearing a bright red shirt, Daniel felt entirely comfortable and secure. The local transit bus was running slightly behind schedule due to the weather and a mechanical issue earlier in the day. As Daniel waited, the rain began to fall a bit harder, washing over the asphalt. A few cars passed by on the wet road, their tires hissing against the pavement. When the delayed bus finally rounded the corner, something was deeply wrong. The bus driver pulled over, but the concrete area beneath the overpass was completely empty. Daniel was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no dropped belongings, and absolutely no tire marks screeching away from the curb. The bright red shirt he was wearing had simply vanished into the gray, rainy afternoon without making a single sound or leaving a trace. When Daniel failed to return home that evening, his family immediately sensed that something terrible had happened. He was incredibly reliable and always called if he was going to be even a few minutes late. His parents quickly contacted the local authorities, and by nightfall, a massive, desperate search operation had blanketed the usually quiet community. Hundreds of volunteers poured into the streets, walking arm in arm through the thick subtropical bushland and knocking on every single door in the neighborhood. They plastered the teenager's face on every storefront window and utility pole, but as the days slowly turned into weeks, the terrifying reality set in. The boy had been abducted in broad daylight. The Queensland Police launched one of the largest missing person investigations in the history of the country. They interviewed thousands of people and chased down endless tips. Slowly, their attention narrowed down to a local man named Brett Peter Cowan. Cowan was a known transient in the area with a dark, deeply troubling criminal history that matched the area. Detectives brought Cowan in for questioning multiple times. They placed him in a small, brightly lit interrogation room, pressing him for hours about his whereabouts on the day the boy vanished. But Cowan was an absolute master manipulator. He sat calmly in the chair, maintaining a steady heart rate, and confidently deflected every single question they asked him. Cowan had an alibi that was just plausible enough to create reasonable doubt. More importantly, he knew that the police had absolutely zero physical evidence. There was no DNA, no security camera footage of his car at the scene, and no fibers linking him to the boy. Cowan practically smiled at the frustrated detectives, knowing they could not legally hold him. The case went completely cold for years. Daniel's heartbroken family refused to give up establishing a national foundation and wearing bright red clothing every year to keep his memory alive in the public eye. But legally, the police were entirely paralyzed. Cowan moved to a different state, confidently believing he had gotten away with the perfect crime. By 2011, the original detectives were completely desperate. They knew Cowan was responsible, but standard police work had completely failed. They realized that to catch a man who left no physical evidence and felt completely untouchable, they had to bypass his logic. They needed him to voluntarily confess, requiring a massive deception. The Queensland Police authorized a highly classified undercover operation known as a Mr. Big Sting. This technique is incredibly elaborate, incredibly expensive, and extremely dangerous. It involved creating an entirely fake, highly lucrative organized crime syndicate from the ground up, staffed entirely by highly trained undercover police officers playing roles. The sting began on a commercial passenger flight. An undercover officer acting as a wealthy, connected criminal arranged to sit directly next to Cowan. During the long flight, the officer struck up a casual conversation, complaining about the legal system and flashing a significant amount of cash. He bought Cowan a drink, establishing a friendly rapport. When the plane landed, the undercover officer offered Cowan a ride and casually mentioned that his organization was always looking for reliable people to do small, well-paid jobs. Cowan, who was struggling financially, eagerly took the bait. A few days later, the officer called him and offered him a few $100s to help move some stolen electronics. Over the next several months, the fake syndicate slowly pulled Cowan deeper into their entirely fabricated world. They paid him thousands of dollars in cash to transport illegal goods, stand guard during fake meetings, and deliver envelopes full of money. They treated him like a brother, inviting him to expensive dinners and praising his criminal loyalty. Cowan became completely intoxicated by his new life. He felt powerful, respected, and incredibly wealthy. The undercover officers surrounded him with luxury, ensuring he felt entirely insulated from the regular world and the police. He believed he had finally found a family of like-minded individuals who operated completely outside the boundaries of normal society. Once Cowan was entirely dependent on the syndicate for his money and his social life, the officers slowly began to introduce a problem. They casually mentioned that the big boss of the entire organization, a terrifying and incredibly powerful man known only as Mr. Big, was looking to promote Cowan to a much higher, permanently lucrative position within the family. However, there was a massive catch. The undercover officers told Cowan that the organization had highly placed contacts inside the police department. These corrupt cops had warned them that Cowan was still the prime suspect in a massive missing child case from years ago. They told Cowan that this kind of intense police heat was terrible for their business. They flew Cowan out to a luxurious hotel in a different city for a high-stakes meeting with the ultimate boss. The tension was incredibly thick as Cowan was led into a massive, dimly lit hotel suite. Sitting behind a large desk was Mr. Big, played by a veteran undercover officer with a commanding, deeply intimidating presence. He did not smile when Cowan entered. The boss looked Cowan directly in the eye and laid out the terms. He said he had the power, the money, and the corrupt police connections to make the old investigation completely disappear forever. He promised to erase the files and guarantee Cowan would never spend a single day in a prison cell. But the boss demanded absolute honesty in return for this favor. Mr. Big leaned across the table and told Cowan that he could not protect him from loose ends. If there was a body out there or a piece of evidence that the police might accidentally find, the entire syndicate could be brought down. The boss demanded to know exactly what happened on that rainy Sunday in 2003, framing it as a security issue. Cowan sat in the quiet hotel room, his mind completely racing. He was blinded by the promise of unlimited money and guaranteed freedom. He felt completely safe in this room full of wealthy criminals. Slowly, he opened his mouth and began to speak. Hidden cameras and tiny microphones recorded every single horrific detail as Cowan finally admitted to the crime. But a spoken confession was not quite enough for a solid legal conviction. Mr. Big nodded slowly and told Cowan that they needed to clean up the mess permanently. He ordered Cowan to physically take his top lieutenants out to the exact location where the body was hidden so the syndicate's cleanup crew could move the remains and destroy any lingering evidence. Cowan agreed without hesitation. He got into an SUV with the undercover officers, completely unaware that the vehicle was wired with high-definition audio and video recorders. He guided them deep into the thick, overgrown wilderness of the Glass House Mountains, miles away from the quiet overpass where the terrible nightmare had originally begun years prior. As they walked through the dense bushland, Cowan calmly pointed out the exact coordinates. He showed the undercover officers exactly where he had left the boy, chatting casually about the terrible crime as if he were discussing the local weather. He felt completely invincible, bragging to his new criminal brothers about how easily he outsmarted the police force. The undercover officers marked the exact GPS location in their minds. As soon as they returned to the city, the entire massive illusion was instantly shattered. Uniformed police heavily surrounded Cowan's vehicle. He was ripped out of the car and thrown to the pavement. The wealthy criminals he thought were his best friends calmly pulled out their police badges. Forensic teams immediately descended upon the exact coordinates Cowan had provided in the Glass House Mountains. Digging carefully through the thick dirt and heavy tree roots, they finally uncovered the physical evidence that had been missing for 8 agonizing years. They found the tragic remains along with the distinct remnants of a bright red faded shirt. The legal trial was swift and incredibly absolute. When the prosecutors played the high-definition video of Cowan casually bragging about the crime to the fake crime boss, the courtroom fell completely silent. The master manipulator, who thought he was smarter than the entire legal system, watched his own arrogance permanently seal his absolute and final destruction. In 2014, Cowan was convicted and sentenced to life in a maximum security prison. The Queensland Police had executed one of the greatest, most elaborate undercover operations in modern history. They built an entire fake criminal empire from the ground up, spending millions of dollars and countless hours entirely dedicated to trapping a ghost. To build a massive, heavily funded fake mafia sting just to catch one person is a testament to the lengths people will go for justice. The trap was a grand illusion stretched across vast cities and state lines. But what happens when the deception is not a sprawling operation but a quiet secret kept on a single street? We shift from a massive undercover syndicate crossing state borders to a quiet, claustrophobic small town where absolutely everyone knows everyone. At roughly 11 o'clock at night, on a cool Saturday in April of 1997, a 16-year-old girl named Eva Blanco was walking down a quiet street in Algete, Spain. Algete was a peaceful, tightly knit suburban municipality located just a short drive outside Madrid. It was the kind of perfectly quiet community where absolutely everyone knew their neighbors and families lived on the exact same streets for generations without ever experiencing true fear. It was a place where people felt so incredibly secure that they frequently left their front doors unlocked during the day. The local shop owners knew all the children by name, and the streets were generally considered completely safe for teenagers to wander after the sun went down. Violent crime was virtually non-existent, and the atmosphere was always relaxed and deeply warmly familiar to everyone who called the small town their permanent home. Eva was a bright, deeply responsible high school student who had spent the evening enjoying a fun weekend party with a close group of friends. She was a completely typical teenager, full of positive energy and entirely dedicated to her studies and her loving family. After saying a cheerful goodbye to her friends at the end of the night, she began the short, highly familiar walk back to her parents' house under the glowing yellow suburban streetlights. The spring air was slightly chilly, and a light mist had begun to form over the pavement as the night wore on. Eva walked along the quiet residential sidewalks, her footsteps echoing softly against the brick walls of the sleeping houses. She felt entirely comfortable in her hometown. There was absolutely no reason for her to feel anxious or look over her shoulder in the dark shadows because the streets had always been a perfectly safe haven for her entire life. She was supposed to be home just before midnight, a strict curfew she almost never missed. Her parents were asleep in their warm house, completely trusting in their daughter's highly reliable nature and the absolute safety of their small town. But as the clock slowly ticked past midnight and into the early hours of Sunday morning, the quiet house remained entirely undisturbed. The front door never opened, and her bedroom remained totally empty in the dark. When the sun finally rose on Sunday morning, her mother walked down the hallway and gently opened Eva's bedroom door to wake her up for the day. Instead of finding her daughter sleeping peacefully, she found the bed completely made and entirely unslept in. A sudden heavy knot of pure physical dread instantly formed in her stomach. Eva was deeply responsible and had never spent the night away from home without calling her parents first to ask for permission. Frantic phone calls were immediately made to all of her friends who had attended the party the night before. Every single person confirmed that Eva had left the gathering at a reasonable hour to walk straight home alone. Absolute panic began to spread rapidly through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Her parents rushed out into the completely normal-looking streets, desperately searching the exact route she usually took, hoping to find her sitting on a bench. A few agonizing hours later, the local authorities received a terrifying phone call. A passerby walking along a lonely, unpaved service road on the very outskirts of the town had discovered something lying in a muddy drainage ditch. The police rushed to the desolate location, their sirens screaming through the quiet morning. They arrived and found the broken body of 16-year-old Eva Blanco left abandoned in the damp, freezing spring grass beside the dirt road. The horrifying reality of the scene struck the responding officers like a heavy, physical blow. The bright, responsible student had suffered a brutally violent and completely unprovoked attack before her young life was taken. The absolute brutality of the crime was completely alien to the quiet, peaceful streets of Algiers. It was an act of pure evil that entirely shattered the town's innocence and plunged the community into a state of deep, suffocating grief. As the forensic technicians carefully combed through the muddy ditch, they managed to find one single, incredibly crucial piece of physical evidence. The attacker had been careless enough to leave behind a distinct biological sample containing perfectly intact DNA. The investigators carefully preserved the biological material, completely confident that modern forensic science would quickly reveal the killer and bring swift justice to the devastated local family. They took the pristine DNA sample to the National Crime Laboratory and aggressively ran it through every single criminal database in the country, expecting an immediate digital match. But the computer screens returned absolutely nothing. The genetic profile of the killer did not exist in any law enforcement system anywhere in Spain. Whoever committed this terrible crime had absolutely no prior criminal record and had completely evaded police detection until now. Because the killer was not a known criminal in the national system, the police began to focus heavily on the town of Algiers itself. This was not a community that attracted random tourists or passing strangers late at night. The terrifying geographical logic dictated that the person who hunted Eva down in the darkness was almost certainly someone who lived right there in the neighborhood, perfectly familiar with the layout of the completely isolated service roads. The realization that the murderer was likely a local resident caused a dark, suffocating cloud of extreme paranoia to descend upon the entire town. People instantly stopped leaving their doors unlocked. Neighbors began looking at each other with deep, unspoken suspicion every time they walked outside. The man who committed this atrocity was hiding in plain sight, perhaps even buying his daily groceries at the exact same local market as the grieving parents. Every time a man walked down the street, the women of Algiers wondered if his hands were the ones that had cornered Eva in the dark. The killer could have easily been the local mechanic, a respected school teacher, or the friendly man living directly next door. This invisible, lingering dread completely consumed the town, transforming a previously idyllic and safe haven into a terrifying psychological prison where absolute trust was completely destroyed. Days turned into agonizing months, and those months slowly bled into long, incredibly frustrating years. The police interviewed hundreds of people, followed up on thousands of desperate tips, and completely exhausted every traditional investigative technique available to them. But without a direct database match to the genetic material left at the crime scene, the investigation stalled entirely, and the tragic case of Eva Blanco eventually went completely cold. For 18 long years, the family of Eva Blanco and the people of Algete carried the incredibly heavy burden of unresolved grief and deep suspicion. A whole new generation of children grew up in the town, always warned by their anxious parents to never walk home alone at night. The empty drainage ditch on the edge of town remained a haunting, quiet reminder of the violent ghost who had never been captured and was likely still breathing the same air as them. In the year 2013, an entirely new avenue of forensic science began to mature. Genetic genealogy and advanced familial DNA mapping allowed scientists to look significantly beyond direct profile matches. Instead of just looking for the exact killer, investigators realized they could use the old DNA sample to search for any biological relatives of the man who committed the crime, tracing the genetic lineage backwards to find the absolute truth. The Spanish authorities devised an incredibly bold and entirely unprecedented plan to finally break the cold case open. They returned to Algete and publicly asked every single male resident of the town to voluntarily submit a cheek swab for a massive DNA collection drive. They were not accusing the entire town of murder. They were simply hunting for a tiny, microscopic genetic thread that could connect the killer's preserved DNA to a living relative in the area. The response from the community was absolutely overwhelming. Hundreds of local men willingly lined up to provide their saliva samples, desperate to finally clear the dark cloud hanging over their streets. They knew that if the killer still lived among them, he would likely refuse to provide a sample, which would instantly highlight him as a major suspect to the highly observant detectives who were closely watching exactly who chose to stay away from the clinic. But the killer did not show up to refuse the test. He had long since vanished from the area entirely. However, the mass collection of local DNA gave the forensic scientists exactly what they needed to build a highly complex genetic roadmap. They processed all the voluntary samples and fed them into a massive genetic tree, comparing the town's genetic makeup against the killer's preserved profile in hopes of finding a branch that pointed in the correct direction. After months of grueling laboratory work, the scientists finally found a faint but undeniably real genetic link. One of the men in the town who had voluntarily submitted his DNA shared a partial genetic structure with the killer. It was a distant familial match. This local resident was not the murderer, but he shared common ancestors with the violent man who had taken Eva's young life. The invisible wall protecting the killer had finally developed a massive crack. The detectives immediately interviewed this innocent man and began tracing his specific family tree backward through time. They built a massive chart of his uncles, cousins, and distant relatives, slowly narrowing down the sprawling branches. They focused their intense search on anyone in that specific bloodline who had been living in or visiting the town of Algete during the exact window of the terrible crime that occurred in the spring of 1997. The genetic map eventually pointed directly to a specific family of North African descent who had temporarily settled in the area during the exact time of the murder. The focus narrowed incredibly sharply to two brothers from this family who had abruptly left Spain shortly after the crime occurred. After 18 years of chasing a completely invisible shadow, the investigators now had actual names and faces securely attached to the lingering phantom. Working closely with international law enforcement agencies, the Spanish police tracked the two brothers across borders. They discovered that one of the brothers, a man named Ahmed, was currently living a quiet, completely unassuming life in France. He had spent the last 18 years raising a family and blending perfectly into a new community, thinking he was entirely safe from the terrible past and completely untouchable by the Spanish police force. The French authorities began quietly surveilling Ahmed as he went about his daily routine. They needed a fresh sample of his DNA to confirm the match without alerting him to their hidden presence. They patiently waited for him to discard a personal item in public. When he finally threw away a used item on the street, the undercover detectives quickly retrieved it from the trash and rushed it directly to the forensic laboratory for immediate genetic testing. The genetic material extracted from the secretly recovered item was compared directly to the 18-year-old evidence preserved from the muddy ditch in Algete. The scientific results were absolutely indisputable. It was a perfect 100% match. The invisible monster who had haunted a small Spanish town for nearly 2 decades, forcing neighbors to turn against one another in fear, was finally backed into an inescapable cold concrete corner. In October of 2015, French tactical police raided Ahmed's home and placed him in heavy iron handcuffs. He was completely shocked, realizing that a microscopic drop of his own bloodline had crossed international borders and stretched across 18 years of time to finally pull him out of the shadows. He was completely powerless as he was immediately extradited back to Spanish soil to finally face justice for the horrific crime he committed. The town of Algete completely stopped what they were doing when the news finally broke on television. People stood in the streets and openly wept, feeling an incredible, overwhelming sense of relief wash over the entire community. The heavy veil of suspicion that had forced neighbors to fear one another was permanently lifted. The faceless killer was finally locked inside a cold, heavily guarded prison cell, proving that the long memory of science never forgets. Ahmed would never face a public trial for his terrible actions. Shortly after being incarcerated, he chose to end his own life in his solitary prison cell, taking his darkest secrets directly to the grave. But his death did not steal the ultimate victory from Eva's family. The completely impossible science of familial DNA had finally proven exactly who he was, providing absolute closure to a deeply grieving community that had waited in the dark for so long. To realize that a killer can hide in a small town behind a veil of genetic anonymity is a truly chilling thought, proving that absolute monsters can successfully masquerade as normal neighbors for decades. But what happens when the deception is not hidden by a fleeing stranger but masked by a sweet, completely trusted smile? We shift from a killer hiding in a small town behind a genetic veil to a killer hiding inside a cozy home behind a sweet, grandmotherly facade. Between the years of 2007 and 2013, in the deeply historical and culturally rich city of Kyoto, Japan, a softly spoken woman named Chisako Kakehi was living a seemingly quiet life. She was in her late 60s, an age where most people are slowing down and settling into the peaceful rhythms of their twilight years. Kyoto is a beautiful city, but like much of the country, it has a rapidly aging population. There are countless elderly men living alone in large, quiet houses, having lost their wives to illness or time. These men often find themselves entirely isolated, surrounded by a lifetime of wealth, but completely lacking any real companionship or daily conversation. Chisako appeared to be the perfect remedy for this specific kind of profound loneliness. She was remarkably sweet, always dressing in modest, neat clothing with a gentle smile that instantly put people at ease. She did not look like a threat. She looked exactly like a kind, deeply caring grandmother who simply wanted someone to share her remaining time with. She frequently utilized matchmaking services and exclusive relationships catered specifically to the elderly. However, behind her sweet smile, Chisako had a very specific set of requirements for marriage. Her profiles explicitly demanded that her potential partner be highly wealthy, living entirely alone. The agencies assumed she simply wanted financial stability and a quiet life without the complicated drama of the relationship. They introduced her to a man named Isao Kakehi, elderly, highly successful, and incredibly handsome. When he met Chisako, he was completely calm, like a soft voice, light hair, and her deep, simple eyes. He quickly integrated himself into his quiet life. He cooked him delicious, highly traditional Indian meals every single day. He kept his house absolutely spotless, folding the laundry perfectly, and arranging fresh flowers in the room. For Isao, the suffocating silence of his empty house was finally broken by the warm, comforting hum of domestic life. He was so deeply grateful for her presence that he happily married her, securing her financial future in his will to ensure she would always be taken care of. For 2 months, they lived as a perfectly happy, completely ordinary elderly couple. Isao felt an incredible sense of relief entirely, believing that he would peacefully live out his final days in absolute comfort. But then the comforting illusion of his safe domestic life abruptly shattered. On a seemingly normal day, just 2 months after their wedding, Isao was resting comfortably in his own home. He had just finished a meal prepared by his loving wife. Without any warning, a sudden agonizing wave of sickness violently washed over his frail, aging body in the living room. His heart began to race uncontrollably, completely out of rhythm. A suffocating tightness gripped his chest, and he collapsed onto the floor, completely unable to draw a full breath. The peaceful, quiet house suddenly felt incredibly small and terrifyingly cold. Within a matter of minutes before any emergency medical help could ever arrive, Isao Kakehi was dead. When the local doctors examined his body, they were not particularly suspicious. Isao was an elderly man with the natural frailty that comes with advanced age. Sudden, catastrophic heart failure was a highly common cause of death for men in his specific demographic. The doctors signed the official death certificate, ruling it a tragic but entirely natural passing. Chisako played the role of the grieving widow with absolute perfection. She cried softly, arranged a beautiful funeral, and gracefully accepted the condolences of his distant friends. She then quietly inherited his massive estate, stepping back into the shadows as a very wealthy woman. It seemed like a completely closed chapter in a very normal, albeit sad story. However, the suddenness of the death caught the attention of a highly observant local detective. As he processed the routine paperwork for Aizhao's estate, he decided to run a background check on the sweet, grieving widow. When the digital records finally loaded on his computer screen, the detective felt a sudden freezing drop in his stomach. The pattern was horrifying. Over the previous 6 years, Chisako had not just been married to Isao. She had been married or in a common-law partnership with 3 other men. Every single one of them was elderly. Every single one of them was incredibly wealthy. And absolutely every single one of them had died suddenly and unexpectedly just months after altering their wills in her complete favor. Through these various brief tragic relationships, this quiet, unassuming woman had amassed a staggering personal fortune of over $8 million. The detective instantly realized that 4 elderly men dying of sudden heart attacks while living with the exact same woman was a statistical impossibility. The quiet grandmother was hiding a very dark, terrifying secret. The police immediately ordered a highly advanced deep toxicology screening on the preserved blood samples taken from Isao during his initial examination. They specifically asked the laboratory technicians to look past the standard markers for heart disease and search for heavy metals and chemical toxins. The results they got back were completely chilling and undeniable. Isao had not died of a natural heart attack. His blood contained a massive, absolutely lethal dose of highly concentrated cyanide. The suffocating terror he felt in his final moments was not his heart failing from age, but a violent chemical shutting down his body at the cellular level. The sweet, caring meals his new wife had been cooking for him were laced with poison. Armed with this terrifying medical evidence, a team of detectives arrived at Chisako's beautiful, quiet home with a search warrant. They expected to find the evidence quickly. They walked through the front door and began to meticulously tear the house apart. But as they searched through the rooms, the deep, unsettling reality of their investigation began to heavily sink in. The house was absolutely immaculate. It smelled of fresh tea and clean linen. There were delicate lace doilies on the tables, perfectly folded blankets on the couch, and family photographs arranged neatly on the shelves. It did not look like the dark lair of a serial killer. It looked exactly like a safe, incredibly cozy sanctuary built by a loving, gentle grandmother. The forensic team scoured the pristine kitchen. They checked every single spice jar, every medicine bottle, and every drawer. They tore up the floorboards, checked the ventilation shafts, and emptied every pocket of her neatly folded clothing. They searched for hours, but they could find absolutely no trace of cyanide, no mixing tools, and no hidden chemical containers. This presented a massive legal problem for the police force. They knew exactly how she killed her husbands, and they knew exactly why she did it, but without finding the murder weapon or the poison itself, it would be incredibly difficult to prove she was the one who administered it. Chisako watched them search with a calm, totally unbothered expression on his face. The lead detective stood in the middle of the spotless living room, feeling a heavy wave of deep frustration. He looked around the perfectly curated space, realizing that a woman this organized and meticulous would never leave a messy trail of evidence behind. She was hiding the deadly weapon in plain sight, blending it perfectly into her completely innocent aesthetic. As he slowly scanned the room one final time, his eyes landed on a row of beautiful, highly manicured indoor potted plants resting near the window. They were lush and green, clearly tended to with incredible care and daily attention. The detective walked over to the plants, noticing how deeply the dark soil had been packed down around the base of the delicate green stems. Acting on pure instinct, he put on a pair of latex gloves and pushed his fingers directly into the damp earth of the largest potted plant. He dug past the roots, moving the dirt aside until his fingers brushed against something completely unnatural hidden deep in the soil. He carefully pinched the object and pulled it up into the bright sunlight streaming through the window. Covered in wet dirt was a tiny, clear plastic bag. It was incredibly small, perfectly sealed, and entirely hidden from the world. The forensic technicians immediately swabbed the interior of the tiny bag. The chemical test instantly turned positive. The bag was completely coated in heavy traces of pure lethal cyanide. The sweet grandmother's perfect facade finally cracked. Chisako had constructed the perfect, undetectable murder method. She would use her sweet demeanor to gain the absolute trust of a lonely, desperate man. She would cook for him, making him feel completely safe in his own home. Then she would dig up the tiny bag from her beautiful houseplant, pinch a microscopic amount of the poison, and stir it gently into his afternoon tea. Because the men were already incredibly old and fragile, the sudden cardiac arrest caused by the poison always looked perfectly natural to the attending doctors. She never used enough to cause a violent scene, just enough to quietly stop their hearts while she sat across the table, watching them take their final breaths with a polite, entirely sympathetic smile on her face. The terrifying banality of her crimes shocked the entire nation of Japan. She had successfully weaponized the deep, quiet desperation of the elderly, transforming their absolute worst fear of dying alone into a highly lucrative, cold-blooded business model. She was the ultimate Black Widow, entirely hiding her absolute lack of empathy behind a warm, comforting domestic mask. During her highly publicized trial, the true depths of her cold calculations were completely laid bare. When the prosecutors presented the evidence of her multiple victims showing the exact timeline of the altered wills and the sudden deaths, she showed absolutely no remorse. She sat in the courtroom with the same quiet, polite demeanor she had used to lure them into the trap. In 2017, a judge sentenced Chisako Kakehi to death for her horrific string of calculated murders. Her defense team fought the conviction for years, but in 2021, the Japanese Supreme Court entirely upheld the original sentence, ensuring that the smiling assassin who monetized loneliness would never walk free in society ever again. To realize that the person cooking your meals and arranging your home is actually a quiet, patient killer completely shatters the fundamental concept of domestic safety. It proves that absolute evil does not always break into your house with a weapon in the dark. Sometimes it knocks politely on your front door in the daylight carrying fresh groceries and a very warm smile. It is incredibly terrifying when a guilty person can successfully hide their own dark crimes behind a mask of total innocence. The deception requires a chilling level of psychological control and absolute emotional detachment. But what happens when that exact psychological dynamic is completely reversed and the power of the human mind is used to fabricate a terrible tragedy? We shift from a deeply calculated woman quietly hiding her own absolute guilt behind a sweet grandmotherly smile in a cozy home to 6 terrified people who were violently forced to believe in their own absolute guilt for a pair of horrific crimes they never actually committed, completely losing their own minds inside the cold, isolated concrete walls of a heavily guarded prison. At roughly 9 in the morning on a freezing Tuesday in the winter of 1974, a young woman named Erla was sitting in a small cafe in Reykjavik, Iceland. She was 20 years old, living a somewhat chaotic but entirely ordinary life with her boyfriend. Iceland was a place of deep, profound safety where violent crime was statistically almost non-existent. It was the kind of deeply trusting society where mothers frequently left their babies sleeping in strollers on the snowy sidewalks outside while they went into shops to buy groceries. The small island nation felt like one massive, tightly knit neighborhood. The police force rarely carried weapons, and the heavy concrete prison cells in the city were almost always entirely empty. Erla and her boyfriend, a young man named Savar, did not belong to the wealthy elite of this quiet society. They lived in a tiny, heavily cluttered apartment on the edges of the city. They occasionally engaged in completely minor, non-violent infractions like petty theft or mail fraud just to pay their monthly rent. But despite their absolute poverty, they felt incredibly safe. They spent their cold winter evenings sitting by the small radiator in their apartment, drinking cheap coffee and listening to the wind howl against the thin glass windows. They were marginalized youth, entirely lacking any significant social connections, but they were deeply in love and just trying to survive. They had absolutely no idea that their poverty made them perfect targets. The absolute tranquility of their island was entirely shattered when 2 local men vanished without a trace in completely unrelated incidents roughly 10 months apart. The first man disappeared into the cold night after visiting a local nightclub, and the second simply never came home from his daily routine. The complete lack of bodies sent the entire nation into a heavy panic. Because there were no witnesses and absolutely no physical evidence of a struggle at either location, the local police were completely paralyzed. They were entirely unaccustomed to handling complex missing persons cases, let alone a potential double homicide. As the freezing weeks dragged on into long months, the massive public outcry became completely deafening across the island. The authorities were under immense, crushing pressure from the highest levels of government to find the missing men and restore the absolute illusion of safety to their quiet streets. In a desperate bid to find answers, the heavily stressed police force began aggressively monitoring the minor criminal element of the city, looking for absolutely anyone they could easily intimidate. One evening in December, heavily armed police officers suddenly kicked down the door of their small, cluttered apartment. They did not ask polite questions or present a formal warrant. They dragged Erla and Savar out into the freezing winter air, throwing them violently into the back of a waiting police cruiser. Erla was entirely confused, assuming it was about a stolen letter. But when she was dragged into the brightly lit, freezing cold interrogation room, the detectives did not mention the minor postal fraud. Instead, they threw heavy black and white photographs of the two missing men directly onto the metal table. They leaned in close, their voices dropping to a terrifying, aggressive whisper, and demanded to know exactly where the bodies were buried. Erla was completely paralyzed by sudden, overwhelming fear. Her throat went completely dry as she stared at the photographs. She stammered, shaking her head desperately, insisting she had never even met the missing men. But the tall detective simply smiled a cold, entirely unforgiving smile. They told her that her boyfriend had already confessed and blamed the entire thing on her. She was violently stripped of her warm winter clothes, forced into a rough canvas prison uniform, and thrown into a tiny, freezing solitary confinement cell. The incredibly heavy steel door slammed shut, plunging her into absolute suffocating darkness. There were no windows, no clocks, and no sound whatsoever. The complete sensory deprivation was an incredibly calculated tactic. The silence in the cell was so absolute that Erla could hear her own blood rushing through her ears. The damp concrete walls felt like ice against her bare skin. She sat on the hard floor, shivering violently in the pitch black, completely unable to tell if it was day or night. Within just a few days, her sense of reality began to completely warp under the heavy, crushing isolation. For the next several weeks, she was deliberately subjected to extreme, agonizing sleep deprivation. Every single time she closed her heavy, exhausted eyes, a prison guard would smash a solid metal baton against the steel door, jarring her awake with a terrifying, deafening crack. Her racing heartbeat refused to slow down, keeping her in a state of constant, unbearable panic. She was dragged out of her tiny cell at all hours of the night, forced to sit under blinding fluorescent lights while multiple detectives screamed directly into her face. They presented completely fake evidence, claiming they had found blood on her shoes and witnesses who saw her driving a stolen car. They hammered these absolute lies into her brain until she could not think straight. Unknown to Erla Savar and 4 other marginalized young people were enduring the exact same horrific psychological torture in the surrounding concrete cells. They were completely isolated from one another, entirely unable to communicate or verify reality. The police kept telling each desperate suspect that the others had already fully confessed, building an inescapable narrative. When sleep deprivation and extreme isolation failed to produce a written confession, the authorities escalated their terrifying methods. They began administering heavy, mind-altering sedatives to the suspects under the absolute guise of medical care. Erla would suddenly wake up in the metal interrogation chair, her vision entirely blurred, completely unable to remember how she got there. Under this immense, crushing psychological weight, a truly terrifying medical phenomenon began to take root in their exhausted minds. It is a deeply documented psychological break known as memory distrust syndrome. When a human being is completely isolated, physically tortured, and constantly told they are a violent monster, their broken brain will eventually stop fighting the lies. Erla began to genuinely doubt her own memory. She sat in the dark, shivering in the freezing cold, trying to remember exactly where she was on the nights the innocent men vanished. Because her life was chaotic, her memories were slightly blurry. The detectives expertly exploited this tiny gap, filling her empty thoughts with incredibly vivid, highly detailed stories of the crime. The aggressive police forced her to completely imagine the horrific crime scene over and over again. They made her visualize the heavy blood, the freezing winter wind, and the exact physical location of the shallow graves. Slowly, the deeply terrifying thing finally happened. Erla stopped pretending. Her shattered mind actually adopted the forced violent narrative as absolute truth. Savar experienced the exact same catastrophic psychological collapse in his own dark cell. He began to vividly recall struggling with the victims, hallucinating entirely fake memories of a violent fight that never actually happened in the real world. The police had successfully hacked into the deepest, most secure parts of their human minds, completely overwriting their identities. Armed with these incredibly detailed, absolutely agonizing confessions, the authorities proudly brought all 6 broken suspects to trial. The public was entirely relieved that the terrifying monsters had finally been caught. The courtroom was freezing cold, packed with angry citizens staring at the pale, heavily medicated young people sitting quietly in the heavy wooden defendant chairs. The legal proceedings completely ignored a massive, glaring physical impossibility. The police had absolutely no bodies, no murder weapons, and 0 forensic evidence at the scene. There was not a single drop of blood, a stray footprint, or a matching fingerprint anywhere on the island. The entire massive case was built completely out of the fragile, shattered minds of the accused. Despite the complete lack of physical evidence, the Icelandic justice system convicted all 6 young people. They were sentenced to incredibly harsh, long-term prison sentences based entirely on the horrifying words that had been violently extracted from their own mouths. The nation celebrated the victory entirely unaware that the real killer was completely free to walk the streets. For decades, Savar Erla and the others sat in their cold concrete prison cells, heavily medicated and completely broken. It took them agonizing years to slowly realize that the horrifying memories in their heads were entirely implanted by the state. When their minds finally began to clear, the immense, crushing horror of their stolen lives hit them with massive physical force. Savar spent the rest of his tragic life desperately trying to clear his ruined name. He wrote endless letters from his cell, begging anyone to look at the massive holes in the original police reports. But the government completely ignored him, refusing to admit that their deeply trusted, highly respected police force had effectively brainwashed 6 entirely innocent young citizens. It was not until decades later that investigative journalists finally began to look deeply into the old, heavily sealed police diaries. They uncovered the horrific interrogation logs, mathematically proving the extreme torture, the solitary confinement, and the heavy illegal drugging. The reporters exposed the absolute nightmare that the authorities had completely fabricated the case. The shocking, undeniable revelations completely rocked the quiet island nation to its core. The massive public pressure eventually forced the highest courts to completely re-examine the old, deeply flawed evidence. In the year 2018, the Icelandic Supreme Court officially overturned the wrongful convictions, formally admitting the young people were entirely innocent. But the official legal pardon could not erase the decades of immense, irreversible suffering. The 2 missing men were never found, and their completely cold cases remain open today. The 6 young suspects had their entire lives stolen, their names forever linked to a horrific nightmare. They went into those small rooms as innocent kids and came out believing they were absolute monsters. To have your own mind weaponized against you, forcing you to believe you committed an atrocity you never did, is a chilling testament to the terror of unchecked authority. But what happens when that exact same state power is used not to force a confession, but to force an impossible lie? We shift from police forcing innocent people to confess to a terrible murder to police forcing the public to blindly believe. A brutal assassination was simply a quiet suicide. At roughly 10 o'clock in the evening on Monday, February 12, 1990, a 58-year-old man named Robert Auko was sitting in the quiet study of his rural farm in Koru, Kenya. Robert was the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the entire country. He was an incredibly brilliant, highly educated, and deeply respected diplomat. After spending weeks traveling across the globe, he had returned to his sprawling agricultural property to seek a few days of absolute peace. The farm in Koru was his ultimate sanctuary. It was nestled in the lush, rolling green hills of western Kenya, far away from the chaotic noise and heavy political pressure of the capital city. He loved the quiet isolation of the countryside. He spent his evenings walking the perimeter of his land, speaking softly with his farmhands and enjoying the warm, heavy night air. It was the only place where he felt entirely safe, surrounded by people who had known him for decades. But on this particular Monday night, the atmosphere inside the main house was incredibly tense. Robert was not relaxing. He was sitting at his heavy wooden desk surrounded by stacks of highly classified government documents. Just days earlier, he had returned from a major diplomatic trip to Washington. During that trip, the massive cracks in the Kenyan government had become completely visible. Robert was actively preparing a detailed report that would expose those deep fractures. He was investigating a massive multi-million-dollar corruption scandal involving the Kisumu Molasses Plant, a sprawling industrial facility that had been drained of funds by high-ranking officials within his own town. Robert was a man of strict integrity, and he was preparing to name names. He knew that the files sitting on his desk were incredibly dangerous. They contained financial records and secret communications that could completely destroy the careers of very powerful men. As the night wore on, the farm grew completely silent. The only sound was the gentle humming of the cicadas and the thick brush inside his window. The large house was secure, and his domestic staff had already gone to sleep in their quarters. Robert packed the sensitive files into his briefcase, locked it inside his personal safe, and prepared for bed. He turned off the lamp in his study, plunging the room into darkness, entirely unaware that the quiet farm was no longer safe. Sometime in the dead of the night, the perfect silence of the property was broken by the sound of heavy tires crunching against the gravel driveway. A white vehicle pulled up near the front gates. Heavy footsteps moved quickly and purposefully across the lawn, approaching the main house. There was no shouting, no sound of broken glass, and no frantic struggle. The intruders knew exactly how to navigate the property without waking the sleeping farmhands in the nearby outbuildings. The next morning, Robert's maid woke up early to prepare his morning tea. She walked into the main house and immediately noticed that something was deeply wrong. The front door was unlocked and sitting slightly ajar. When she went into Robert's bedroom, the bed was empty, but his reading glasses and his essential asthma medication were still sitting on the nightstand. Robert never went anywhere without his glasses or his inhaler. He had simply vanished into the dark night. The local police were immediately called and a massive search operation was launched across the sprawling agricultural property. Because Robert was one of the most famous and beloved politicians in the country, the news of his sudden disappearance sent an absolute shockwave of panic through the capital. Helicopters were deployed to scan the heavy forests, and hundreds of local villagers formed search lines, walking shoulder to shoulder through the thick, tall elephant grass. For 2 agonizing days, the search turned up absolutely nothing. The massive farm and the surrounding hills were completely silent. Then on the morning of February 16th, a teenage boy named Joseph was walking his family's cattle near the base of a small rocky hill known as Gat Alila, located less than 2 miles from Robert's house. As the boy navigated through the thick, thorny brush, he noticed a deeply unnatural, heavy chemical smell hanging in the warm morning air. It smelled like a mixture of raw diesel fuel and burning meat. Joseph tied his cattle to a tree and slowly walked toward a dense cluster of bushes at the foot of the hill. As he pushed the heavy green branches aside, a swarm of flies buzzed angrily into the air. Lying in the dirt, completely hidden from the main dirt road, was the severely burned and heavily broken body of the missing Minister of Foreign Affairs. The horrific discovery completely shattered the peace of the valley. The local police rushed to the scene, taping off the remote area and pushing the terrified villagers away. The crime scene was an absolute nightmare. Robert's body was nearly unrecognizable, heavily charred by a massive, intensely hot fire. A heavy plastic container that previously held diesel fuel was lying in the grass nearby. A brief distance away, investigators found a walking stick, a loaded revolver, a flashlight, and a single matchbox resting neatly on the dry dirt. As the news of the horrific death spread across the country, the Kenyan public demanded immediate answers. They expected the government to launch a massive manhunt for the brutal assassins who had taken the life of their beloved diplomat. But instead of announcing a murder investigation, the local police commissioner stepped up to a podium, adjusted his microphones in front of the flashing cameras, and confidently announced to the press that the minister had tragically committed suicide. The official police statement was so completely absurd that it instantly sparked massive violent riots across the country. The authorities confidently claimed that Robert had walked 2 miles into the thick brush in the middle of the night without his glasses. They claimed he then somehow managed to violently break his own ankle in 2 separate places. After shattering his own leg, the police stated that he poured a gallon of diesel fuel completely over his own clothing. According to the official government narrative, the 58-year-old man then took out a revolver, shot himself directly in the side of the head, and then, while technically dead from a massive gunshot wound, struck a match and set his own fuel-soaked body on fire. The sheer physical impossibility of this sequence of events was completely staggering. It defied every single known law of physics, human anatomy, and basic common sense, yet the police refused to back down. The blatant, completely unapologetic lie terrified the public. If the state police were willing to stand in front of the cameras and force the citizens to accept a completely impossible reality, it meant the killers were entirely protected by the highest levels of the government. The people realized that the assassins were not hiding in the shadows. They were wearing official uniforms, sitting in powerful offices, and looking directly into the television cameras without blinking. The international community was completely outraged by the heavy-handed cover-up. The British government placed immense diplomatic pressure on Kenya, absolutely refusing to accept the suicide narrative. Under threat of massive financial sanctions, the Kenyan president was finally forced to invite outside investigators to examine the evidence. A team of highly elite detectives from Scotland Yard, led by Detective Superintendent John Troon, immediately flew into the country. Detective Troon was a meticulous, deeply serious investigator who had seen decades of violent crime, but he was completely appalled by the state of the investigation in Kenya. When he arrived at the rocky hill of Gat Alila, he realized the local police had deliberately trampled the crime scene, moving evidence and destroying tire tracks. But despite their frantic efforts to erase the truth, the physical laws of forensic science were entirely immune to political corruption. Troon ordered a full independent autopsy by a British forensic pathologist. The medical results immediately shattered the official government lie. The autopsy proved that Robert's leg was violently broken by a heavy, blunt object, completely incapacitating him. The gunshot wound to his head was fired at a specific downward trajectory that was physically impossible for him to have inflicted himself. He was shot in an execution style, and the gun was later wiped completely clean. Most damning of all, the medical examiner found absolutely zero smoke inhalation or carbon monoxide in Robert's lungs. This meant he was completely dead long before the fire ever started. He did not burn himself. The assassins had murdered him in a completely different location, loaded his lifeless body into the back of a white vehicle, dumped him at the bottom of the hill, and poured diesel fuel over his remains to completely destroy any lingering forensic evidence. Detective Troon shifted his focus from the burned body to the missing motive. He requested access to Robert's rural farmhouse, walking through the quiet rooms until he found the heavy metal safe in the study. When he forced the safe open, he discovered that the highly sensitive files regarding the Kisumu Molasses Project were completely gone. The assassins had not just come for the man. They had come for the paperwork that threatened to expose their massive financial crimes. Troon spent 110 days conducting a massive, heavily guarded investigation, interviewing hundreds of terrified witnesses who had seen government vehicles moving through the valley on the night of the murder. He compiled a massive, deeply detailed official report that directly named several highly powerful government ministers as the primary suspects. He proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the assassination was a highly coordinated state-sponsored execution. But when Troon formally submitted his massive report to the Attorney General, the absolute crushing weight of state power slammed down like a heavy concrete door. The government officially dissolved the investigative commission before they could issue any arrest warrants. The lead suspects were briefly detained for a public show, but they were quickly released due to a supposed lack of evidence. The Scotland Yard detectives were quietly but firmly forced to leave the country entirely. For decades, the true mastermind behind the assassination was never brought to justice inside a courtroom. The government continuously blocked subsequent public inquiries, ensuring that the dark truth remained officially buried under a mountain of heavy bureaucracy. The files remained missing, the witnesses were deeply intimidated into complete silence, and the beautiful, quiet farm in the green hills of Koru became a haunting monument to a completely unresolved political nightmare. The tragedy of Robert Auco is a terrifying reminder of what happens when the very institutions designed to protect the truth are entirely controlled by the people trying to hide it. The police literally commanded the public to look at an absolutely murdered man and believe he had broken his own bones, shot himself in the head, and set himself on fire. It is a chilling demonstration of how absolute power can completely overwrite physical reality without a shred of hesitation. To see a powerful politician found dead under completely gravity-defying, highly suspicious physical circumstances leaves a dark, lingering paranoia in the mind. It forces you to realize that if the people at the very top want someone completely erased, the local police will happily help them tie the knot. But what happens when that exact same political violence crosses international waters? We shift from a powerful politician found dead under suspicious circumstances in a valley to a powerful billionaire found dead hanging under a bridge in the shadows of London. At roughly 6 in the morning on Friday, June 18, 1982, a postal worker was walking through the misty streets of central London. He was making his standard early morning commute across Blackfriars Bridge, a massive iron structure spanning the River Thames. The air was incredibly damp and cold, carrying the heavy scent of river water and city exhaust. The city was just beginning to wake up, and the bridge was completely empty in the quiet dawn. As the man walked along the pedestrian pathway, something strange caught the edge of his vision. The bridge was undergoing routine maintenance, and complex metal scaffolding was erected along the underside of the massive arches. He paused and leaned over the heavy stone parapet, looking down into the deep, dark shadows beneath the iron beams. Hanging from a thick orange rope completely suspended over the rushing river water was the lifeless body of an elderly man. The postal worker frantically ran to find a telephone and called the local authorities. Within minutes, the river police arrived in a small patrol boat, navigating the treacherous morning tides to reach the heavy scaffolding. When they carefully cut the orange rope and lowered the man into their boat, they realized he was wearing an incredibly expensive, perfectly tailored Italian suit. He had a fake passport in his pocket, but his true identity was quickly confirmed. The deceased man was 62-year-old Roberto Calvi. He was not a local London resident. He was the powerful chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, one of the absolute largest and most influential private banks in all of Italy. Because of his incredibly close, highly secretive financial ties to the Vatican, he was widely known in international circles as God's banker. He was a man who held the absolute darkest financial secrets of the Italian elite and the global mafia network. Just days before his body was found hanging under the iron bridge, Calvi's massive banking empire had completely collapsed in a devastating financial scandal. A staggering $1.3 billion had simply vanished from the bank's ledgers. Facing immediate arrest and deeply fearing for his life, he had shaved his distinct mustache, secured a fake passport, and fled Italy in the dead of night, desperately trying to escape the powerful men he had just bankrupted. He arrived in London as a completely desperate fugitive, hiding in a modest rented flat and nervously waiting for his powerful friends to rescue him. He spent his final days pacing the small apartment, jumping at every shadow, and making frantic phone calls to his associates across Europe. He was absolutely terrified, telling his family that he could not trust anyone and that a highly organized hit squad was actively hunting him down in the quiet streets of the city. Despite his extreme paranoia and clear assertions that he was being hunted, the British authorities conducted a swift initial investigation. They concluded that the heavy stress of the massive financial ruin had simply broken the elderly banker. They believed he wandered out of his flat in the middle of the night, climbed over the heavy stone wall of the bridge, and ended his own life. The coroner officially ruled the tragic death a completely straightforward suicide. The suicide ruling was immediately rejected by Calvi's grieving family. They knew Roberto was a deeply religious man who considered taking his own life an unforgivable sin. He had also just booked a private flight to flee to South America the very next day. He was a man actively planning for his absolute survival, not a man preparing for his absolute end. They hired elite private investigators to look closer at the crime scene photographs from the massive stone bridge. As the independent investigators began to carefully review the police files, the official suicide narrative completely fell apart. The physical evidence made absolutely no logical sense. When the river police pulled his body from the water, they discovered that his expensive suit pockets were heavily stuffed with sharp masonry bricks. He was also carrying exactly $15,000 in various foreign currencies shoved deep into his heavily damp jacket pockets. The absolute most glaring impossibility was the physical condition of his clothing. Calvi was a severely overweight 62-year-old man suffering from extreme vertigo. To hang himself, he would have had to climb over a high stone parapet in the pitch-black night, climb down a 12-foot vertical drop, and navigate across highly complex rusted metal scaffolding, while his pockets were heavily weighed down with sharp bricks. It was a completely absurd physical feat. Yet, despite this supposedly grueling acrobatic climb in the dark, his clothing was completely pristine. There was not a single speck of orange rust or a single scratch of yellow paint anywhere on his incredibly expensive Italian leather shoes. His delicate suit pants were not torn, and his fingernails were completely clean. It was physically impossible for an elderly man to perform such extreme movements on wet iron scaffolding without leaving a single scuff mark. Furthermore, there were no traces of brick dust underneath his fingernails, proving he had never actually touched the heavy masonry blocks found completely stuffed into his own pockets. The rope itself was tied in a highly complex nautical knot, a skill the urban banker absolutely did not possess. The deeper the investigators looked into the physical mechanics of the hanging, the more they realized that Roberto Calvi had clearly never climbed the metal structure at all. Investigators also discovered a massive glaring gap in the timeline. Calvi was last seen leaving his rented flat late Thursday night. He was terrified, telling his close associates that powerful men were coming to completely silence him. He had packed his bags and was actively preparing to flee to a completely different country. He was completely focused on escaping the city. Why would he walk miles through the freezing rain just to hang himself from a public bridge? For decades, his family aggressively fought the British legal system, completely refusing to back down from the highly flawed suicide ruling. They demanded new autopsies and hired forensic experts to completely reconstruct the impossible mechanics of the hanging. As the years slowly passed, new forensic technology and a deep understanding of the river tides finally provided the absolute truth, proving exactly how the impossible physics of the crime scene had been achieved. Roberto Calvi did not climb down the heavy scaffolding from the bridge above. He was brought to the structure from the freezing water below. The investigators analyzed the exact tidal charts of the River Thames for that specific Thursday night in June. They realized that during the darkest hours of the early morning, the rushing river tide had risen high enough for a small motorized boat to pull directly underneath the heavy iron arches entirely hidden from the street. The assassins had lured Calvi out of his flat, promising him a safe escape route out of London. They loaded him onto a small boat, drove him out into the freezing river, and strangled him to death in the absolute dark. Once he was completely dead, they stuffed his pockets with heavy bricks and $15,000. Then they simply stood on the deck of the rising boat and tied the rope to the lowest rung of the scaffolding, letting the receding tide hang his body. The bizarre items found on his body were not random weights meant to sink him. They were a highly orchestrated, deeply symbolic warning to anyone else who might think about exposing the financial secrets of the global elite. In the secretive world of Italian organized crime and deeply corrupt political lodges, every single detail was a message. The heavy masonry bricks stuffed into his pockets were a direct, undeniable reference to the powerful society of Freemasons. Even the incredibly specific location of the murder was chosen for its dark symbolism. The assassins specifically drove the boat to Blackfriars Bridge because Calvi was deeply entangled with a highly illegal, absolutely ruthless secret society in Italy known as the Propaganda du Masonic Lodge. Members of this completely corrupt shadow organization frequently referred to themselves as the Black Friars. The execution was an incredibly loud, undeniably clear message. The massive amount of foreign currency left completely untouched inside his pockets was another clear signal. The assassins were explicitly showing the police and the criminal underworld that this was absolutely not a random robbery. Leaving $15,000 completely abandoned on a dead man proved that the killers were wealthy, completely unbothered by money, and entirely focused on silencing the banker before he could testify about the massive missing funds. Calvi's death completely sent shockwaves through the highest levels of the Vatican as his bank was deeply intertwined with their own financial institutions. Several high-ranking religious officials were heavily implicated in the massive fraud, leading to widespread rumors that the church itself had quietly sanctioned the execution to completely protect its own vast wealth and highly guarded reputation from the devastating public fallout of a massive, global criminal trial. In the year 2007, a full 25 years after his broken body was pulled from the freezing Thames, several high-ranking figures associated with the Italian mafia were finally brought to trial in Rome for the brutal assassination of God's banker. It was a massive, highly publicized legal battle that attempted to finally shed light on the absolute darkest corners of the deep political corruption that had plagued the Italian government for decades. However, because so much time had passed and crucial forensic evidence was completely lost or destroyed during the initial botched suicide investigation by the British authorities, the prosecutors simply could not secure a conviction. The physical ties to the boat and the rope were entirely gone. Without absolute direct physical evidence placing them under the bridge, the men were entirely acquitted, walking completely free from the massive, sprawling murder conspiracy. The horrific murder of Roberto Calvi remains one of the greatest unresolved conspiracies in modern history. The British courts eventually formally overturned the original suicide verdict, officially recognizing that the powerful banker was the victim of a highly sophisticated, completely brutal assassination. It proved that in the incredibly dark, deeply secretive world of international finance, absolutely no one is untouchable, no matter how much money they tightly control. To realize a powerful man can be hunted across borders and executed in the shadows beneath a bridge is deeply chilling. It is a highly targeted, completely silent violence designed to send a specific message. But what happens when the violence is not a quiet assassination in the dark? We shift from a targeted, silent assassination of one man in the dark shadows to a chaotic military-style massacre of completely innocent families walking through a grocery store in broad daylight. At roughly 7:30 in the evening on Saturday, November 9, 1985, the small city of Aalst in Belgium was winding down. The air was incredibly crisp and cold, signaling the fast approach of a heavy winter. In the heart of the commercial district, the bright fluorescent lights of the local Delhaize supermarket glowed warmly against the dark, freezing streets, welcoming families inside to complete their weekly errands in absolute safety. Inside the massive grocery store, the atmosphere was completely ordinary and deeply comforting. It was a Saturday night, a time usually reserved for families to run out and grab supplies for their Sunday dinners. Parents were slowly pushing heavy metal shopping carts down the wide aisles. Children were eagerly picking out colorful snacks and sugary cereals, while the cashiers chatted quietly with regular customers at the checkout counters near the front doors. A supermarket is universally considered to be one of the absolute safest, most mundane environments in the modern world. It is a brightly lit, highly predictable space filled with the basic necessities of daily life. The people walking through the aisles in Aalst that evening were entirely relaxed, thinking only about their upcoming meals, their weekend plans, and getting back to their warm homes. There was absolutely no reason to look over their shoulders. But as the heavy automatic glass doors slid open to let a departing customer out into the cold night, the absolute safety of the supermarket was permanently shattered. 3 heavily armed men suddenly stepped through the entrance, moving with terrifying speed and deep, absolute silence. They were wearing dark, heavy clothing, and their faces were entirely obscured by terrifying, bizarre carnival masks and heavy tactical face paint that hid their human features. The first man, who would later be widely known by terrified witnesses as the Giant, was incredibly tall and heavily built, moving with a commanding, highly authoritative presence. The second man, known as the Killer, was slightly smaller but moved with a deeply unsettling, highly aggressive, nervous energy. The third man, quietly lingering near the exit to guard the doors, was an older, slightly slouched figure who simply watched the front of the busy store. The shoppers standing near the checkout lines completely froze, staring in absolute confusion at the three masked figures. In a normal robbery, criminals immediately start shouting demands and pointing handguns at the cash registers. But these men did not speak a single word. Instead, they raised heavy military-grade combat shotguns directly at the innocent families standing in line, completely bypassing the cash registers entirely and pointing the weapons at them. Without issuing a single demand for money, the man known as the Killer pulled the heavy trigger. The deafening, completely explosive sound of the combat shotgun firing inside the enclosed, echoing walls of the supermarket was absolutely paralyzing. The glass storefront immediately shattered into a million pieces. Innocent people holding nothing but bags of bread and milk collapsed onto the polished tile floor as total, absolute blind panic swept through the store. Parents frantically grabbed their young children, desperately diving behind thin metal shelves loaded with canned goods and boxes of pasta, completely terrified and entirely unable to understand what was happening. This was absolutely not a standard robbery. The heavily armed men were not rushing to empty the tills. They were slowly, methodically walking down the bright aisles, executing anyone who crossed their path with absolute cold-blooded military precision. The level of violence was completely and terrifyingly disproportionate to any logical criminal motive. They shot men, women, and young children at point-blank range. After spending several agonizing minutes terrorizing the store and taking lives, they casually walked over to a single cash register, forcefully grabbed a few $100s in small change, and calmly walked back out the shattered front, doors disappearing into the dark, freezing Belgian night. When the local police and emergency medical teams finally arrived at the Delhaize supermarket, they were completely horrified by the scale of the absolute devastation. 8 innocent people had been murdered in a matter of minutes, and over a dozen more were heavily wounded. The grocery store looked exactly like an active military war zone, filled with shattered glass, overturned shopping carts, and the heavy, suffocating smell of burnt gunpowder hanging in the air. But the absolute most terrifying aspect of the Aalst massacre was that this was not an isolated random event. The entire country of Belgium had been living under the dark, heavy shadow of these exact same masked men for over 3 agonizing years. Between 1982 and 1985, this heavily armed crew had carried out a massive string of highly coordinated, brutally violent attacks on restaurants, small businesses, and multiple supermarkets. By the time they walked out of the store in Aalst, they had officially murdered 28 innocent people and severely wounded dozens more across the country. The Belgian public was entirely paralyzed by deep, suffocating fear. Nobody wanted to go out to eat, and families were completely terrified to simply go grocery shopping. The randomness of the targets meant that absolutely anyone anywhere could be the very next victim of the terrifying masked executioners. The National Police Force launched the absolute largest, most heavily funded criminal investigation in the entire history of Belgium. But as the top detectives began to carefully review the evidence left behind at the various crime scenes, they realized that absolutely nothing about these attacks made any logical sense. The behavior of the 3 masked men completely contradicted every single known psychological profile of standard armed robbers or desperate thieves. Over the course of 3 years and dozens of violent raids, the gang had stolen a relatively tiny amount of money. In some of the attacks, they completely ignored large stacks of valuable cash sitting right in front of them, choosing instead to steal completely worthless items like cheap coffee, a single bottle of wine, or a few basic groceries. Yet to obtain these nearly worthless items, they were perfectly willing to completely slaughter entire innocent families. Furthermore, the tactical movements of the Giant and the Killer were incredibly distinct. Ballistics experts and military veterans who analyzed the security footage noted that the men did not move like common street thugs. They moved with highly coordinated, absolutely flawless military precision. They used complex hand signals, perfectly covered each other's blind spots, and handled their heavy combat shotguns with the absolute confidence of highly trained soldiers. They specifically used the Italian-made SPAS 12 combat shotgun, an incredibly heavy, highly complex tactical weapon that requires significant specialized training to fire rapidly and effectively without jamming. Common criminals in the early 1980s simply did not have access to or the deep mechanical knowledge to properly maintain this specific type of highly restricted military-grade hardware. The attackers were clearly highly trained professionals. The terrifying realization that a highly trained paramilitary hit squad was actively roaming the country executing grocery shoppers for mere pocket change completely baffled the investigators. If the primary motive was not financial gain, then what was the actual purpose of the extreme violence? A dark, incredibly deeply unsettling theory began to slowly emerge from the shadows of the intelligence community known by political experts as the strategy of tension. The strategy of tension is a deeply sinister political tactic. It involves a rogue faction often tied to state security deliberately committing horrific acts of public terror. The absolute goal is to make the population feel so completely unsafe they will gladly beg for a highly militarized police state. Detectives wondered if the violence was designed to destabilize the government by violently destroying the absolute baseline of public safety in a local grocery store. This terrifying theory remained entirely speculative until exactly 1 year after the final massacre in Aalst. In November of 1986, a group of young men were exploring a heavily wooded, deeply isolated area near a local canal. As they waded into the murky, freezing water, they stumbled upon several heavy bags, entirely submerged beneath the dark surface. When they pulled the heavy canvas bags up onto the muddy riverbank, they made a massive discovery. Inside the heavily waterlogged bags, investigators found a massive cache of highly specific physical evidence completely tied to the masked gang. They found the Heavy Spa's 12 combat shotguns used in the supermarket massacres, alongside several specific bulletproof vests, stolen riot gear, and the terrifying, highly distinct carnival masks worn by the Giant and the Killer. It was the absolute motherlode of physical evidence the police had been desperately searching for. But the massive discovery quickly turned into an absolute chilling nightmare when the investigators looked closely at the specific bags the weapons had been carefully hidden inside. The heavy waterproof canvas duffel bags did not belong to a random criminal or a local hunter. They were clearly stamped with the official insignia of the Belgian State Police Force. The weapons used to slaughter 28 citizens had been packed away inside government-issued equipment. This single piece of physical evidence completely shattered the entire investigation. The horrifying implication was immediate and completely undeniable. The men who had been terrorizing the country for 3 agonizing years were likely not random paramilitaries. Evidence heavily suggested they were rogue members of the elite state police, a highly militarized faction known as the Gendarmerie, using their own specialized training to hunt down the public they swore to protect. The sudden revelation caused an absolute earthquake within the Belgian justice system. As independent investigators began to look deeply into the old police files, they discovered a terrifying pattern of internal sabotage. Crucial pieces of physical evidence collected from the various crime scenes over the years had quietly and completely vanished from highly secure police evidence lockers. Fingerprints were mysteriously lost, and original documents were fully shredded. Even more disturbing was the timeline of the canal discovery itself. Independent divers had thoroughly searched that exact same stretch of the murky canal a year earlier and found absolutely nothing. The heavy canvas bags full of official police gear and murder weapons had clearly been dumped into the water long after the initial search was completed. Someone with deep, highly classified inside knowledge of the investigation had deliberately planted the evidence there. Witnesses who had survived the terrible supermarket massacres were brought in to help create composite sketches of the Giant whose mask had briefly slipped during one of the attacks. When the final police sketch was entirely completed and released to the top investigators, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. The detailed drawing of the ruthless killer bore a completely striking, undeniable resemblance to a high-ranking officer within the state police force. Despite these massive, completely terrifying internal clues, the official investigation was repeatedly completely paralyzed by deep bureaucratic roadblocks and sudden, unexplainable transfers of the lead detectives. Every single time a dedicated investigator got too close to uncovering the absolute truth behind the strategy of tension, they were completely removed from the case, and their deeply detailed files were entirely buried in the massive, highly secure state archives. The Belgian government eventually extended the legal statute of limitations completely, specifically for this single horrific case, allowing the deeply frustrated investigation to officially remain open for decades. But despite massive public inquiries, highly publicized parliamentary hearings, and countless completely desperate pleas from the grieving families of the 28 victims, the heavy iron veil of absolute state secrecy was never completely pierced by the courts. To this day, the true identities of the Giant, the Killer, and the Old Man remain entirely unconfirmed by the Belgian legal system. No one has ever been formally convicted of the horrific supermarket massacres. The terrifying men in the masks simply completely vanished into the shadows, leaving behind a deeply traumatized nation and a massive, completely unresolved conspiracy that reaches into the absolute highest levels of the heavily armed state. Security apparatus. To realize that the terrifying monsters hunting innocent families in the bright aisles of a grocery store might not be common criminals, but the very police officers sworn to absolutely protect them completely shatters the fundamental concept of a safe society. It leaves an incredibly dark, lingering chill, knowing that the absolute worst threat to a peaceful everyday life might be completely hiding perfectly in plain sight wearing a state uniform and a heavy metal badge. As we reach the end of these 12 journeys into the darker corners of the human experience, it is natural to feel a heavy, lingering chill. We have traveled through freezing rain, locked hotel rooms, and silent valleys, but the final event, we explored the horrific massacres in the brightly lit aisles of those Belgian supermarkets, leaves a completely different kind of psychological weight resting on our shoulders. It is a weight born entirely from the destruction of the ordinary. There is a specific, deeply unsettling reason why the story of the Brabant killers remains so incredibly haunting even after 4 decades have passed. It completely shatters the fundamental illusion of domestic safety that we all unconsciously rely upon. A grocery store is arguably the most mundane, predictable environment in modern human society. It is a place of bright fluorescent lights, soft background music, and the innocent, entirely routine gathering of basic daily nourishment. When you push a metal shopping cart down an aisle, your mind is completely occupied with incredibly simple, harmless choices. You are thinking about what to feed your children, what you might need for the upcoming weekend, and how quickly you can return to the warmth of your home. You are completely vulnerable, both physically and psychologically. You have absolutely no reason to engage your survival instincts because the space is explicitly designed to be a completely safe haven. The sheer terror of this story comes from the violent desecration of that absolute safety. The masked men did not choose a dark alleyway, an isolated highway, or a dangerous neighborhood in the dead of night. They deliberately walked through the automatic sliding glass doors of a brightly lit sanctuary in the early evening. By choosing the most innocent environment possible, they sent a terrifying unspoken message to the entire nation. They proved that absolutely nowhere was truly safe. Adding to this deep psychological horror is the complete absence of a logical, understandable criminal motive. When we hear about a violent bank robbery, we can at least understand the basic human greed driving the horrific actions. We can categorize the danger. But these heavily armed men shot innocent parents and young children at point-blank range for a few handfuls of completely worthless pocket change. The extreme violence was not a means to an end. The extreme violence was the goal. They wore terrifying carnival masks and heavy tactical face paint to completely strip away their own humanity. They did not shout demands, and they did not negotiate. They moved in absolute terrifying silence, communicating only through the deafening, explosive roar of their heavy combat shotguns. This lack of communication transforms them from mere criminals into an entirely faceless, almost supernatural force of absolute destruction, sweeping through the completely defenseless aisles. But the true nightmare, the absolute darkest layer of this tragedy, is what it reveals about the complex structures of human society and the terrifying nature of state power. We all live under a collective social contract. We willingly surrender a portion of our absolute freedom, and we pay our taxes in exchange for the promise of physical protection. We trust that the people wearing heavy metal badges and carrying government-issued weapons are the ultimate shield against the darkness. The heavily supported theory of the strategy of tension completely inverts that sacred trust. It suggests that the absolute worst monsters in the country were not hiding in the shadows of the criminal underworld. They were sitting at the very top of the social order. The terrifying implication is that rogue elements within the elite state police deliberately slaughtered innocent families simply to manipulate the political landscape and terrify the voting public into deep submission. If the people sworn to protect you are actually the ones hunting you, the foundation of society instantly crumbles into dust. Who do you call for help when the men breaking through the glass doors are the exact same men dispatched to investigate the crime scene? It is an inescapable, claustrophobic nightmare. The shield did not just fail to protect the innocent people in those supermarkets. The heavy shield was violently melted down and forged into a massive, completely bloody sword. This reveals a deeply unsettling truth about the bureaucratic nature of absolute evil. When corruption reaches the highest levels of a government institution, it does not look like a chaotic movie villain. It looks like perfectly organized, completely silent paperwork. It looks like heavy evidence bags quietly disappearing from secure lockers in the dead of the night. It looks like brilliant, deeply dedicated lead detectives suddenly being transferred to entirely different departments. It shows us that true monsters do not always act with wild, impulsive rage. Sometimes absolute evil is incredibly patient, highly coordinated, and heavily funded by the very taxpayers it is actively destroying. The men who orchestrated this terrifying campaign of violence sat in warm offices wearing crisp uniforms, completely insulated from the horrific bloodshed they ordered. They viewed human lives as entirely disposable pawns on a massive, cold political chessboard of power. And perhaps the most chilling aspect of this societal revelation is the heavy complicity of silence. A massive conspiracy of this incredibly dark magnitude requires the absolute silence of dozens, if not hundreds, of heavily involved individuals. It requires file clerks to look the other way when documents vanish. It requires patrol officers to ignore the striking resemblance between a police sketch and their commanding officer. It relies entirely on the paralyzing fear of the truth. This forces us to confront a very dark question about our own human nature. How many people within that massive state security apparatus strongly suspected the terrible truth, but chose to remain completely silent just to protect their own careers, their own pensions, and their own families? The tragedy of the Brabant Killers is not just a story about three violent men with shotguns. It is a deeply terrifying case study in how entire institutions can rot quietly from the inside out. So, what is the ultimate message we should take away from this profound, completely unresolved darkness? It would be incredibly easy to listen to these 12 stories and decide that the world is simply a terrifying, entirely hopeless place. It would be easy to lock your doors, completely withdraw from society, and view every single stranger as a potential threat. But succumbing to that absolute paralyzing paranoia is exactly what the architects of terror desperately want us to do. The true takeaway from this horrific chapter of history is the absolute necessity of demanding total transparency from the powerful institutions that govern our daily lives. Trust is a beautiful, incredibly vital component of a functioning society, but blind trust is incredibly dangerous. We must respect the authority that protects us, but we must also tirelessly watch the watchers. Power that operates entirely in the dark without any public accountability will always breed monsters. We must also recognize the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of completely unimaginable terror. Even after 4 agonizing decades of bureaucratic roadblocks, missing evidence, and deep political silence, the families of the 28 victims have never stopped fighting for the absolute truth. They continue to organize protest and demand answers from their government. Their enduring courage completely outshines the cowardly, masked violence of the killers. These grieving families refuse to let the memories of their loved ones fade into the cold, dusty archives of an unsolved case file. They remind us that while evil can strike with sudden, devastating force, the pursuit of justice is a long, completely unbreakable chain of enduring love. The killers may have temporarily, completely shattered the peace of the supermarket aisles, but they entirely failed to break the enduring, powerful spirit of the people they left completely heartbroken. The story also serves as a profound reminder to cherish the completely mundane, quiet moments of our everyday lives. We often take the safety of a grocery store trip, a quiet walk in the rain, or a peaceful evening in a hotel room entirely for granted. We complain about the long lines at the checkout counter or the heavy traffic on the way home, completely forgetting that the simple privilege of existing in a safe, deeply predictable routine is actually an incredibly fragile gift. Every time you walk through the automatic sliding doors of a brightly lit store, completely unbothered by the world around you, you are experiencing the absolute beauty of a peaceful society. We must deeply, fiercely protect that peace, not by living in constant fear, but by remaining deeply vigilant and deeply compassionate toward our neighbors. We must build communities that are so incredibly strong and tightly knit that the dark shadows of terror can never find a place to safely hide. As we finally close the heavy book on these 12 incredible stories, I want you to take a deep breath and look around the completely quiet room you are sitting in right now. Listen to the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of passing cars outside your window, and the soft, entirely familiar rhythm of your own breathing. Appreciate the profound, completely beautiful safety of this exact moment. Let the lingering chill of these dark tales slowly fade away into the night. And as a quick reminder before you finally turn off your screen and go to sleep tonight, please make sure your doors are completely locked, your security cameras are fully active, and your windows are completely secured against the dark. The world is an incredibly beautiful, wonderful place, but as we have completely learned today, the absolute darkest shadows can sometimes quietly slip through the most innocent, brightly lit cracks in our perfectly normal lives. Stay safe, everyone.